When I was getting ready to go to my daughter's house for a nice family dinner, my lawyer sent me a text message that made my blood run cold. He said, "Call me immediately. Do not sign anything tonight." When I dialed his number, what he told me about my own flesh and blood completely shattered my heart. But I did not cancel the dinner. Instead, I put on my best suit, walked right into their trap, and smiled. I am Wesley, 69 years old, and until that evening I thought I had a family. As a self-made man who built a shipping empire from the ground up, I am used to dealing with cutthroat competitors. I just never expected to find them sitting at my own dining table. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart people who thought they could take advantage of your hard work and kindness. It was a crisp Thursday evening. I was standing in my bedroom adjusting the knot of my burgundy tie in the tall mirror. I was genuinely looking forward to seeing my daughter Kendra. Since my beautiful wife Naomi passed away 5 years ago, Kendra was all I had left. Or so I thought. My phone buzzed loudly on the mahogany dresser. It was Ethan Hayes, my corporate attorney, and a man who absolutely never panics. His text message simply read, "Call me immediately, do not go to dinner, do not sign anything." I dialed his number, my fingers suddenly feeling very heavy. Ethan answered on the first ring. He did not bother with pleasantries. He took a deep breath and told me that earlier that afternoon, Kendra and her husband Logan had quietly filed a petition in family court. They were seeking a full medical and financial conservatorship over me. They had submitted heavily doctored medical statements claiming I was suffering from severe dementia and was no longer fit to manage my own affairs. They wanted total control of my entire estate, my shipping company, my commercial properties, everything. I stood there staring at my reflection in the mirror, listening to Ethan explain how they planned to strip away my freedom. Logan, my polished and constantly smiling son-in-law, had been the mastermind, but my own daughter had willingly signed her name on that petition. The betrayal felt like a physical blow to the chest. But a man does not survive 40 years on the docks by crying when he gets hit. I thanked Ethan, hung up the phone, and finished tying my tie. I drove my sedan across town to their upscale neighborhood. Logan's tech startup had supposedly been doing well, or at least that was the illusion he projected with his leased sports cars and tailored suits. When I knocked on their heavy oak door, Kendra answered. She wore a designer dress I had probably paid for, though she would never admit it. She gave me a warm hug, kissing my cheek and telling me how much she missed me. It took every ounce of self-control I had not to pull away and demand to know why she was doing this. Instead, I patted her back and played the role of the loving, clueless father. I walked into the dining room. The table was set with fine china polished silverware and crystal glasses that sparkled under the modern chandelier. Logan greeted me with a wide, confident grin, shaking my hand far too firmly the way a salesman does when he thinks he has an easy mark. He immediately poured me a generous glass of a very expensive red wine, swirling it in his glass. He went on and on about a new vintage he had discovered, playing the role of the perfect, caring son-in-law who only wanted the best for his wife's aging father. We sat down to dinner. We had roasted duck-fresh asparagus and herb-roasted potatoes. The food smelled wonderful, but it tasted like ash in my mouth. I chewed slowly, complimenting Kendra on her cooking, asking polite questions about her day. Halfway through the meal, Logan wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and cleared his throat. The atmosphere in the room suddenly shifted. He leaned forward and said, "Wesley, we know how much you hate dealing with paperwork lately, but my accountant was looking over some end-of-the-year tax documents for the family trust, and there are just a few routine things we need you to sign to maximize your deductions for the business." Kendra reached over to the wooden sideboard and produced a sleek black leather folder. She slid it across the glass table toward me, placing a heavy, gold-plated pen right next to my plate. "Just sign where the brightly colored sticky tabs are, Dad," she said, offering me a sweet, innocent smile that did not quite reach her eyes. I looked down at the folder. They really thought I was a fool. I grew up with absolutely nothing in a neighborhood where trust was a luxury we could not afford. I started out sweeping warehouse floors on the night shift, saving every single penny to buy my first delivery truck. My late wife Naomi and I sacrificed everything to build a multi-million-dollar shipping and logistics company through sweat, sleepless nights, and brutal negotiations. You do not survive in the commercial freight business without knowing exactly what every single contract says before you put your name on the dotted line. I know a trap when I see one. I slowly opened the folder. The first 2 pages were standard tax forms exactly as Logan had promised. But I did not just blindly look at the sticky tabs. I casually turned the page and flipped to the 3rd sheet. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon hidden in the middle of the paragraph. It was not a tax form at all. It was a comprehensive waiver of my medical rights and a legal acknowledgement of cognitive decline. If I signed that piece of paper, I would be legally admitting that I was mentally incompetent. I would be handing them the exact loaded gun they needed for their court case tomorrow morning. They sat there watching me in complete silence, holding their breath like predators waiting for a trap to snap shut. A lesser man might have screamed. A lesser man might have stood up, flipped the heavy dining table, and cursed them both to hell for their treachery. But anger is a luxury you cannot afford when you are fighting a war. And as of tonight, I was officially at war. I looked up from the document and met my daughter's eyes. I gave her a warm, trusting smile. "Oh, these old eyes are getting so tired," I said, chuckling softly. "Let me just grab my reading glasses from my pocket." I reached into my coat. As I did, I intentionally let my elbow swing wide. My arm caught the stem of the crystal wine glass Logan had so generously filled. The glass tipped over in slow motion. A thick wave of dark red wine flooded across the table, washing directly over the open leather folder and soaking the documents completely. "Oh no," I gasped, fumbling with my cloth napkin and making it much worse by smearing the red wine deep into the fragile paper. "I am so terribly sorry. Look at what a clumsy old fool I am. I completely ruined your important paperwork." The silence in the dining room was absolute. Kendra stared at the destroyed documents, her mouth slightly open in complete shock. Logan gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. His jaw clenched, and I could clearly see a vein throbbing in his temple. He tried to force a polite laugh, but it sounded like a dying animal. "It is fine," Wesley Logan muttered through gritted teeth. "We can easily print another copy." I shook my head sadly. No, I am just too exhausted tonight," I said, standing up and patting my coat. "I think I better head home and get some rest. We can handle all this confusing paperwork another day." I thanked them for the lovely dinner, walked out the front door, and got into my car. As I pulled out of their driveway, the confused smile vanished from my face. They thought they were dealing with a weak, senile old man. They had no idea they had just woken up a monster. The silent adjustment had begun. The next morning, I was sitting in the sleek, glass-walled conference room of my lawyer's downtown office before the sun had even fully risen over the city skyline. Ethan Hayes sat across from me, his sleeves rolled up, a thick stack of financial dossiers spread across the polished mahogany table. He had been working all night, digging into the shadows of my son-in-law's life. The truth he uncovered was far worse than a simple case of greed. Logan did not just want my money to fund a lavish lifestyle. He was desperate. Ethan slid a heavily redacted bank statement across the table. Logan's flashy tech startup was a complete sham. It was a black hole burning through cash, producing absolutely nothing of value. 6 months ago, to keep up the illusion of success, Logan had taken out a $3 million bridge loan. He did not go to a traditional bank. He went to a private, unregulated lending syndicate. The kind of people who do not send collection letters, but instead send men with broken noses to have quiet conversations in dark parking lots. The deadline for repayment was looming, and Logan was completely out of capital. But that was not the part that made my chest tighten. Ethan pulled out another document highlighting a signature at the bottom of the loan agreement. Kendra had co-signed the debt. My own daughter had tied her name, her credit, and her future to a $3 million obligation to dangerous criminals. If they defaulted, those men would not just come for Logan. They would come for her. That was the real reason behind the dinner last night. That was the reason for the medical conservatorship petition. They needed liquid cash, and they needed it immediately. They planned to declare me mentally incompetent, seize control of my shipping business and my commercial real estate, and liquidate everything I had built over 40 years to pay off their massive mistake. I stared at my daughter's signature for a long time. I thought about my late wife, Naomi, and how hard we had worked to ensure Kendra would never know the sting of poverty. We had shielded her from the harsh realities of the world, and in doing so, we had raised a woman who believed consequences were for other people. I placed the document back on the table, folding my hands together. I looked at Ethan and told him it was time to cut the safety net. 10 years ago, shortly before Naomi passed away, we had set up the Memorial Trust. It was an emergency fund designated specifically for Kendra, holding a substantial amount of liquid assets and high-yield bonds. It was meant to be her ultimate protection. However, as the sole trustee, I had included a specific clause. If the beneficiary was ever under severe financial duress or under investigation, I had the absolute right to freeze the account to prevent the funds from being seized by hostile creditors. I ordered Ethan to invoke that clause immediately. I told him to lock the trust down so tight that not even a single dollar could be withdrawn without my physical signature and a federal judge's approval. Ethan nodded, tapping away at his laptop. He warned me that this would be a direct declaration of war. I told him the war had already started last night at the dinner table. We were just firing the first real shot. Within 10 minutes, Ethan hit the enter key. The digital walls slammed down around the Memorial Trust. Every credit card linked to that account, every automated transfer, and every access portal Kendra had was instantly terminated. I did not have to wait long for the reaction. Exactly 14 minutes later, my cell phone vibrated in my coat pocket. The caller ID flashed Kendra's smiling contact photo. I answered the phone, keeping my breathing slow and steady. I expected her to be screaming. I expected her to be demanding to know why her cards were declining. But she did not raise her voice at all. Instead, her tone was chillingly calm, dripping with a thick, artificial sweetness that made my stomach turn. "Dad," she said, her voice sounding like a primary school teacher talking to a confused toddler. "The bank just called me about some strange activity. Why are you doing this? Sweetie, did you forget to take your medication again? You have been acting so erratic lately." I gripped the phone, refusing to let her hear my anger. I told her I was perfectly fine and that I knew exactly what she and Logan were trying to do. She sighed a soft, exaggerated sound of pity. "Oh, Dad," she murmured. "Your paranoia is getting worse. But do not worry. I am taking care of everything. The doctors are on their way to your house right now to help you." The line went dead. A jolt of pure adrenaline shot through my veins. I knew exactly what she meant. I stood up so fast my heavy leather chair hit the glass wall behind me. I told Ethan to stay by his phone, rushed out of the office, and sprinted to my car in the parking garage. I drove toward my estate, my mind racing through every possible scenario. I pushed the engine as fast as I safely could, navigating the morning traffic with a singular focus. When I turned onto my quiet, tree-lined street, my worst fears were confirmed. There were 3 vehicles parked haphazardly in my wide, circular driveway. One was a marked police cruiser. The second was a white county van. The third belonged to Adult Protective Services. I parked my car on the street and walked up my brick pathway, my posture straight and my face completely devoid of emotion. I pushed open my heavy mahogany front door. The sight that greeted me was a nightmare. My pristine, meticulously organized home had been completely trashed. A heavy oak side table was overturned in the hallway. Cushions from my expensive leather sofa were thrown across the living room floor. But the kitchen was the worst. A carton of spoiled milk was poured over the granite countertops, dripping onto the hardwood floor. Rotted, foul-smelling garbage from the outside bins had been dragged in and dumped across the dining table. And beneath the stench of the garbage, I smelled something far more dangerous: raw gas. One of the burners on my professional-grade stove had been left wide open without a flame. An older woman with an ID badge around her neck stood in the center of the kitchen, writing frantically on a clipboard. A uniformed police officer stood near the doorway, holding a hand over his nose. When they saw me, the officer immediately stepped forward, holding his hand up. "Mr. Wesley," he said, his voice firm but cautious, "please step outside into the fresh air. Your daughter called us." She was terrified. "She said you have been having severe dementia episodes, that you have been destroying your own property and leaving the gas on. She said you were a danger to yourself." The social worker looked at me with deep, unmistakable pity. She told me they were here to escort me to a psychiatric evaluation facility for my own safety. Any normal man would have lost his temper. A normal man would have yelled, cursed, and desperately tried to explain that he was being framed. But if I raised my voice, if I acted erratic or angry, I would be giving them exactly what they wanted. I would be providing the symptoms of the crazy, unpredictable old man my daughter claimed I was. Instead, I walked over to the large windows and calmly pushed them open to air out the gas. I turned to the police officer, straightened my suit jacket, and spoke in a low, perfectly measured tone. "Officer, I appreciate your concern, but my cognitive faculties are entirely intact. I am the victim of a very poorly executed staging." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I explained to them that as the owner of a major shipping logistics company, security is my top priority. 2 years ago, I had a state-of-the-art military-grade camera system installed throughout the entire property. The lenses are microscopic, hidden flush inside the crown molding of every single room. They record directly to a secure cloud server that only I control. I opened the security application, tapped on the kitchen camera feed, and handed the phone to the police officer. The social worker leaned in to look at the screen. I told the officer to rewind the footage to exactly 30 minutes ago. The video buffered for a second before playing in crisp, high-definition color. The screen showed my kitchen perfectly clean and empty. Then the back door handle jiggled. The door opened and Logan walked in. He was wearing dark clothes and carrying a heavy trash bag from my outdoor bins. The officer watched in stunned silence as Logan proceeded to tear the kitchen apart. He dumped the garbage on the table. He grabbed the milk from the fridge, poured it on the counters, and threw the carton on the floor. Then, right before leaving, Logan walked over to the stove, turned the gas dial, and slipped out the back door. The timestamp on the video proved he had left just minutes before the police sirens arrived. The officer handed my phone back, his face flushed with embarrassment and sudden anger. The social worker lowered her clipboard, apologizing profusely. I told them no apology was necessary, but I expected a formal report filed regarding my son-in-law's breaking and entering, as well as the false emergency report. They assured me it would be handled immediately, cleared the gas from the house, and quietly left the property. I stood alone in the center of my trashed kitchen. The silence of the empty house pressed heavily against my ears. I picked up my phone again. I did not care about the spilled milk or the garbage. I needed to see something else. I opened the security app and switched the feed to the front porch camera. I rewound the footage to the very beginning, right before Logan entered the house. I wanted to see how he had bypassed my heavy-duty deadbolt without triggering the perimeter alarm. I watched the screen as Logan walked up to the front door. He did not have lockpicks. He did not force the door. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. I zoomed in on the high-resolution image. It was a brass key with a very distinct bright yellow plastic cover over the bow. My chest felt tight, as if a heavy stone had been placed directly over my heart. I recognized that yellow key. Exactly 1 month ago, Kendra had come to visit me. She complained that she felt disconnected, that she wanted a spare key to my house just in case of a medical emergency so she could always reach me. I had handed her that exact yellow key, trusting her completely. Logan did not steal it. Kendra had given it to him. She did not just sit by while her husband planned to destroy me. She had actively handed him the weapon. She had unlocked the door to my ruin. I closed the app and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The last remaining shred of parental illusion I held onto evaporated into thin air. They wanted a war. Now they were going to get a massacre. The next morning, the reality of my daughter's betrayal had hardened into a cold, unbreakable resolve. I was sitting at my kitchen island drinking black coffee when my phone rang. It was Marcus, my chief foreman, down at the main shipping yard. He had worked for me for 20 years and was not a man who startled easily, but his voice was tight with tension. He told me that 3 unmarked black SUVs had just blocked the primary loading bays. A dozen men in cheap leather jackets had stepped out and were currently harassing our drivers. They were not stealing cargo. They were disrupting operations. They intimidated the forklift operators, smashed the windshield of a transport truck, and threatened the logistics managers. When Marcus confronted them, the lead thug casually handed him a fake business card and claimed they represented a new private security firm hired by my son-in-law. They loudly announced to my entire crew that the current owner was losing his mind, that the business was going under, and that new management was stepping in to clean up the mess my senility had caused. Logan was getting desperate. Because I had frozen the Memorial Trust, his deadline to pay back the $3 million to his criminal lenders was closing in like a tightening noose. He needed cash, and he needed a judge to grant the conservatorship immediately. By sending thugs to my yards, he was trying to manufacture a crisis. He wanted my daily shipping operations to grind to a halt so he could walk into court and present financial records showing a massive drop in productivity. He wanted to point at the chaos and blame it on my declining mental state. He expected me to panic. He expected me to drive down to the docks, get into a screaming match with his hired muscle, maybe even throw a punch and get myself arrested for assault. That would be the final nail in my coffin. A police report showing an elderly man acting violently erratic at his own workplace would hand Kendra the conservatorship on a silver platter. I did not give them the satisfaction. I told Marcus to tell the men to stand down, let the trucks idle, and absolutely not engage with the thugs. Then I hung up and made a different phone call. I did not call the cops. I called my lead accountant and Ethan Hayes. I ordered them to initiate a complete corporate sweep. Over the past 4 decades, I had built my shipping empire from a single truck into a logistics powerhouse. But I had also structured it with the kind of financial fail-safes that only a man who trusts no one would design. Within an hour, I was sitting in a secure boardroom with my financial team. I authorized the immediate liquidation of all available operating capital. Every single dollar in our corporate checking accounts, every revolving line of credit, and every reserve fund was instantly wire transferred into a heavily encrypted offshore trust located in the Cayman Islands. This trust was legally completely insulated from any domestic family court rulings or conservatorship claims. I paid off my vendors 3 months in advance to ensure my loyal workers and partners would not suffer. Then I systematically drained the company dry. I transferred the titles of my entire fleet of trucks into a newly formed holding company under a different corporate name, leasing them back to my own business for $1 a month. By the time the sun began to set, my massive shipping company was nothing more than an empty shell. On paper, the business was still running, but the vault was entirely bare. If Logan and Kendra somehow managed to convince a judge to give them control of my company, they would not find the $3 million they desperately needed to pay off the mob. They would find 0 liquid assets, a mountain of structured lease liabilities, and empty bank accounts. They were trying to rob a bank, and I had just quietly removed every single gold bar out the back door while they were busy breaking the front windows. I spent the rest of the afternoon meticulously reviewing the transfer documents, feeling a deep, grim satisfaction. I had successfully turned my life's work into a financial landmine. When Logan finally stepped on it, the explosion would leave him with absolutely nothing. I drove home that evening feeling victorious. The streets were quiet and the crisp night air felt refreshing against my face. I had outsmarted them at every turn. I had blocked their trust fund, exposed their staged break-in, and emptied the corporate accounts they were trying to steal. I parked my sedan in the driveway and walked up the brick pathway toward my front door. The porch light was surprisingly off, casting the entryway into deep shadow. I assumed the bulb had burned out. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my keys, and inserted the deadbolt key into the lock. Just as I turned the metal cylinder, a heavy footstep sounded behind me. I froze. A man stepped out from the dense bushes near my front window. He was not a police officer. He was not an agent from Adult Protective Services. He was wearing a clinical white coat, but there was nothing medical about the cold, dead look in his eyes. In his right hand, he held a prepared syringe, the needle glinting faintly in the moonlight. Before I could turn to run, 2 enormous men in dark scrubs stepped out from the shadows on the other side of the porch, completely blocking my escape route down the driveway. They were built like linebackers, their faces completely devoid of expression. The man in the white coat took a slow step forward. He spoke in a calm, practiced voice that sent a shiver down my spine. "Good evening, Mr. Wesley," he said smoothly. "Your daughter Kendra is very worried about your current state of mind. She hired our private transport service to ensure you get the urgent psychiatric rest you need." My heart hammered against my ribs. Kendra had realized that the legal route with the police and social workers was not going to work. So she bypassed the state system entirely. She used Logan's dirty connections to buy off an unlicensed private sector extraction team. They were not here to evaluate me. They were here to make me disappear. The man in the white coat stepped closer, his voice dropping its polite facade and hardening into a cold command. He told me to hold still, warning that the medication would burn terribly if I struggled. The 2 massive orderlies closed the distance, grabbing my arms with grips like iron vices. I knew at my age I could not physically fight off 3 grown, muscular men. A violent struggle would only give them the bruises and the chaotic scene they needed to legally prove I was dangerously unstable. I had to outsmart them right then and there. I let my body go completely limp, feigning absolute terror and submission. The medic smirked confidently, stepping inside my personal space and raising the large syringe toward my left shoulder. I waited for the exact fraction of a second when the metal tip pierced my suit jacket and broke my skin. As soon as I felt the sharp sting, I violently flexed my bicep and twisted my shoulder inward with every ounce of physical strength I possessed. There was a sudden, sickening snap. The medic cursed loudly, jumping backward as the fragile needle broke off cleanly halfway through the injection. A large portion of the clear liquid spilled uselessly onto the sleeve of my expensive coat. I still received some of the heavy sedative, but nowhere near the massive full dose intended to knock me unconscious for hours. The chemical hit my bloodstream almost immediately. My vision instantly blurred at the edges and my knees buckled under my own weight. The two orderlies hauled me up by my armpits, my feet dragging heavily across the brick pathway. I let my head roll forward against my chest, completely relaxing my facial muscles to play the part of a heavily sedated and helpless patient. They dragged me roughly down the long driveway toward a waiting van with heavily tinted windows and absolutely no medical markings. They tossed me inside onto a narrow transport gurney, quickly strapping thick leather belts tightly across my chest and legs to secure me. I kept my eyes shut tight and forced my breathing into a slow, rhythmic pattern matching the breathing of a man in a deep, chemically induced coma. The heavy rear doors slammed shut, plunging the back of the van into semi-darkness. The engine rumbled to life, sending a vibration through the metal floor. Through the hazy fog of the sedative, I heard the front doors open and shut. Two very familiar voices began speaking over the hum of the engine. It was Kendra and Logan. They had been waiting inside the vehicle the entire time, cowardly watching their hired thugs assault me on my own front porch. A wave of profound, sickening disgust washed over my entire body, but I did not twitch a single muscle. What my treacherous daughter and her husband did not know was that a man who negotiates multi-million-dollar freight contracts in sketchy international ports never walks around unprepared. The thick rubber soles of my custom Italian leather shoes housed a high-capacity, voice-activated micro-recorder. I had discreetly turned it on with a subtle tap of my heel against the pavement the moment the thugs cornered me on the porch. Now it was silently capturing every single word of their damning conversation. Logan sounded frantic, his voice completely stripped of its usual arrogant, polished charm. He asked Kendra if the dosage was enough to keep me locked away and out of their hair until Monday. She replied coldly that the private medic assured her I would be completely incapacitated for at least 48 hours, which was all the time they needed to finalize their theft. Logan let out a loud, heavy sigh of relief. He then started laying out the final phase of their desperate scheme. He explained that since my corporate bank accounts were completely drained, they had to liquidate a massive hard asset immediately. The mob creditors were threatening to break his legs by Tuesday morning if he did not produce the $3 million in cash. Logan identified my prime Dockland property, a massive commercial shipping hub worth exactly $5 million. He told Kendra he already had a shady offshore buyer lined up who was willing to bypass all standard property inspections and close the deal over the weekend for a slight discount. All they needed was the legal authority to sign the deed over. Kendra laughed, a dry, heartless sound that echoed in the front cabin of the van. She told him to stop worrying like a child. She confidently stated that her lawyer would be standing in front of the emergency family court judge first thing tomorrow morning. Armed with the fabricated police report from the kitchen incident and a fraudulent medical evaluation from the corrupt medic who just drugged me, she was guaranteed to be granted full temporary conservatorship. They were going to steal my $5 million property, sell it to criminals, pay off Logan's debt, and leave me locked in a padded room to rot for the rest of my life. The van hit a deep pothole, violently jolting my body against the tight leather straps. The lingering remnants of the sedative were finally dragging my consciousness under, but my mind locked onto the recording safely hidden in my shoe. I had the exact blueprint of their entire endgame. I let the darkness pull me down, knowing exactly what my next move had to be. When I finally opened my eyes again, the harsh, buzzing glare of fluorescent lights blinded me. My mouth tasted like copper and old chalk. I was lying on a stiff plastic-covered mattress that offered no comfort. I slowly turned my throbbing head, taking in my new surroundings. I was in a sterile, completely white room. There were no windows, no television, and absolutely no personal belongings in sight. The heavy steel door across from the narrow bed had no handle on the inside. I pushed myself up, my muscles aching deeply from the rough transport, and swung my legs over the edge of the bed. I immediately checked my feet. My shoes were gone. I was wearing cheap hospital grip socks. I knew my shoes and suit were securely locked in a patient property bag somewhere in this building, and I needed to get them back eventually. The heavy deadbolt on the door suddenly clicked loudly, echoing in the small room. The thick metal door swung open, and a severe-looking woman in gray medical scrubs stepped inside. She wore a cold, highly professional expression and carried a thick metal clipboard. She did not ask how I was feeling. She did not offer me a glass of water. She looked down at me with absolute authority and delivered the final, crushing blow. "Good morning, Mr. Wesley," she said, her voice completely devoid of human empathy. "The emergency judge has reviewed your file this morning. He just granted your daughter full temporary conservatorship over all your medical and financial decisions. You are now legally a ward of the state under her direct care. She stepped back into the hallway and grabbed the heavy door handle. Do not try to cause any trouble or hurt yourself, she added firmly. You aren't leaving this facility. The heavy door slammed shut and the lock clicked firmly into place, sealing me inside my new prison. I stood alone in the center of the suffocating white room. The heavy steel door had shut with a finality that would have broken a weaker man. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing the lingering fog of the sedative out of my mind. Panic is a useless emotion. It clouds judgment and wastes energy. I needed a clear head. I began to pace the narrow dimensions of my cell, systematically assessing my environment. There were no windows to indicate the time of day. There was no clock on the bare walls. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the air conditioning vent in the ceiling. Based on the amount of time I had been unconscious in the transport van, I calculated it was likely late Friday afternoon. That gave me exactly 48 hours. By Monday morning, Logan and Kendra would have the legal paperwork processed and the $5 million Dockland property would be irrevocably transferred to the offshore buyers to pay off the criminal syndicate. I had to make contact with the outside world before the banks opened. I walked over to the heavy steel door and peered through the narrow rectangular strip of reinforced glass embedded at eye level. The hallway outside was bathed in the same harsh fluorescent light. It was quiet, save for a few nurses moving between rooms. I stood there for what felt like hours, perfectly still, watching the routines of the staff. Then I saw my opportunity. A young male orderly, probably no older than 22, walked into my line of sight and leaned heavily against the hallway wall. He looked exhausted. He pulled a smartphone from his scrub pocket and stared at the screen. I watched his face crumble. He aggressively rubbed his eyes, his chest heaving as if he were trying to hold back a sob. He pulled a worn leather wallet from his back pocket, took out a brightly colored credit card, and stared at it with absolute despair. I knew that look. It was the look of a man drowning in debt, staring at a declined notification while his bills piled up. He was desperate, financially cornered, and emotionally exhausted. In my line of work, desperation is a currency. And I was about to make a purchase. I stepped back from the door and moved over to the plastic-covered mattress. When the extraction team had dragged me out of the van, they had stripped me of my belt, my shoes, and my wallet, but they had thrown my heavy wool coat onto the bed, likely considering it harmless. They had checked the pockets, but amateurs only look at what is obvious. They never look beneath the surface. Years ago, after a particularly tense negotiation in a foreign port, I had my tailor sew a hidden zippered compartment deep into the interior lining of the coat. I reached inside the dark fabric, my fingers tracing the familiar seam until I felt the tiny metal zipper pull. I opened it and extracted the heavy, cold metal resting inside. It was a solid gold Patek Philippe watch. I had purchased it to celebrate my very first $1 million freight contract. It was a masterpiece of Swiss engineering, completely untraceable and worth easily $50,000 on the open market. It was an insurance policy worn on the wrist. I waited by the door. 10 minutes later, the heavy deadbolt clicked. The young orderly stepped into the room carrying a small plastic tray with a paper cup of water and 2 white pills. He kept his eyes averted, clearly ashamed of his job. Before he could set the tray down, I moved swiftly. I stepped directly into his path and held out my hand, palm open. The gold watch gleamed under the harsh overhead lights. The orderly froze his eyes, going wide as he stared at the timepiece. He knew exactly what it was. I kept my voice low, speaking with the calm, absolute authority of a man making a corporate acquisition. I know your cards are declining, son, I said smoothly. I know you are drowning. Take this watch. Pawn it this weekend. You will walk out of the shop with at least $30,000 in cash. Pay off your debts. Keep the rest. Change your life. The orderly swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly so the water rippled in the paper cup. What do you want? He whispered, terrified. I did not ask him to unlock the door or help me escape. That would risk his job and his freedom. I only asked for something small. I need your burner phone for exactly 5 minutes, I replied. He looked at the watch, then at the door, agonizing over the decision. Greed and desperation won. He quickly slipped the watch into his pocket, pulled his personal cell phone from his scrubs, unlocked the screen and pressed it into my hand. I did not waste a single second. I dialed Ethan Hayes' direct private number entirely from memory. He answered on the second ring, his voice tight with suppressed anxiety. Wesley, he said sharply, where are you? The GPS tracker in your shoes went dark at a private psychiatric facility outside the city limits. I told him I was fine, but that we had run out of time. Logan and Kendra had expedited their plan. They had the temporary conservatorship in hand and were preparing to sell the Dockland property by Monday. Ethan cursed under his breath, asking if we should send the police with a writ of habeas corpus. I told him absolutely not. A legal battle over my sanity could drag on for months, and I wanted this finished now. "It is time, Ethan," I said, my voice hardening into steel. "Activate the poison pill protocol." Silence hung on the line for a fraction of a second. Ethan knew exactly what that meant. It was a catastrophic legal trap we had designed years ago for hostile corporate takeovers, a mechanism that turned a highly valuable asset into an incredibly toxic liability the moment ownership was transferred under duress. "Are you absolutely sure, Wesley?" Ethan asked. "Once I file this injunction, there is no stopping the fallout. It will destroy anyone holding the deed." I told him to pull the trigger. I deleted the call. History handed the phone back to the pale, sweating orderly and nodded toward the door. "Get out of here," I told him. "Do not tell anyone you saw me." He practically sprinted out of the room, the heavy steel door clicking shut behind him. I sat down on the edge of the stiff mattress, feeling a profound sense of calm wash over me. The trap was set. Now I just needed the rat to take the bait. Not even 5 minutes later, the deadbolt aggressively slammed open again. The door swung wide, hitting the wall with a loud bang. Kendra walked into the sterile room. She was no longer wearing the sweet, concerned daughter mask. Her face was set in a hard, arrogant sneer. In her right hand, she held a thick stack of legal documents and my gold-plated pen. She tossed the paperwork onto my lap. The top page was the absolute transfer deed for the Dockland property. "Sign it right now, Dad," she demanded, her voice dripping with pure malice. "Sign the property over to Logan, or I swear to God I will have the doctor triple your sedatives until you forget your own name." I looked up at my daughter, letting my shoulders slump forward until I appeared frail and small on the stiff plastic mattress. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged, perfectly mimicking the absolute terror of a helpless patient facing the threat of a chemical straitjacket. I held my hands up, letting them shake violently. "Please, Kendra," I whispered, making sure my voice cracked with desperate vulnerability. "Do not let them give me any more of that medicine. It makes my head so dark and heavy. I cannot think straight. I do not want to be trapped in my own mind. Just tell me what you want me to do." She stood over me, her arms crossed tightly, looking down with a mixture of utter disgust and victorious pride. She did not see the father who had worked brutal double shifts on the loading docks to buy her first bicycle. She did not see the man who had stayed awake for 3 days straight to build the company that paid for her luxury cars and Ivy League education. She only saw an obstacle that had finally been crushed into submission. She stepped closer, shoving the heavy stack of legal documents roughly against my chest. She uncapped the heavy gold-plated pen and practically jammed it into my trembling fingers. "Sign the bottom line on every single page," she commanded coldly, her voice echoing off the bare white walls. "You are transferring the commercial Docklands to Logan Holding Company. It is for your own good, Dad. You are simply not competent to manage an asset of that size anymore. Logan and I will take care of it from here." I took the pen. I made sure my grip was clumsy and weak, letting the gold barrel slip slightly against my palm. I looked down at the thick parchment paper resting on my lap. I read the legal jargon quickly but thoroughly. It was exactly what Logan and Kendra had discussed in the transport van. It was an absolute transfer of deed, completely unconditional and effective immediately upon signing. If I signed it normally, the $5 million commercial shipping property would instantly belong to Logan. That would give him exactly the massive collateral he needed to appease his criminal syndicate and pay off his $3 million debt by Monday morning. I let a single tear roll down my wrinkled cheek, completing an Oscar-worthy performance of a broken, defeated old man surrendering his entire life work. I lowered the tip of the pen to the paper. My hand trembled so convincingly that the metal pen tapped rapidly against the clipboard, making a pathetic scratching sound. I dragged the dark ink across the dotted line, finishing the final signature on the last page. Before I could even lift the pen away, Kendra snatched the heavy stack of papers right out of my hands. She quickly flipped through the pages, her eyes greedily scanning the bottom of each sheet to ensure I had not missed a single required signature. A massive, genuine smile broke across her face. It was the exact same bright smile she used to give me when she was a little girl and I handed her a brand new toy. Only now that smile was twisted by pure, unadulterated greed. She carefully slid the documents into a sleek leather portfolio and tucked it tightly under her arm, guarding it like a prized trophy. See, was that so hard? She mocked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she looked down at me. You finally made the right choice, Dad. Now Logan can finally fix the massive financial mess you created with your senility. She turned on her heel, the sharp click of her designer shoes echoing loudly as she walked toward the heavy steel door. She knocked twice with her knuckles, signaling the private guard waiting outside in the hallway to unlock it. As the heavy deadbolt clicked open with a loud metallic thud, she paused in the doorway and looked back at me over her shoulder. The sneer returned to her face, cruel, absolute, and devoid of any familial love. Do not wait up for us to visit this weekend, she said smoothly, adjusting the collar of her expensive coat. We have a lot of banking to do to save your legacy. Enjoy the mashed potatoes, Dad. I hear they serve them every single night here. She stepped out into the bright fluorescent hallway and the heavy door slammed shut behind her. The lock engaged with a loud final click. She was gone, completely convinced she had just successfully stolen my empire and secured her lavish future. I sat alone in the quiet, sterile room. The pathetic trembling in my hands instantly vanished. I casually wiped the fake tear from my cheek and sat up perfectly straight. My posture returned to that of a man who controls boardrooms and commands respect. I let out a low, quiet breath. Kendra was so blinded by her own arrogance and desperation that she completely failed to inspect the actual signatures she had just ripped from my hands. She only saw my name and the ink. She did not notice the subtle, deliberate flaw I had woven into the signature itself. Almost 15 years ago, when my shipping company first started securing massive high-stakes government contracts, Ethan Hayes and I sat down to plan for the absolute worst-case scenarios. Corporate espionage, extortion, and physical coercion are very real threats in the international freight industry. We needed a fail-safe. We established a secret legal distress signal, a highly specific variation of my signature that was legally binding, and filed under seal with the federal courts and my banking institutions. The rule was simple. If I ever signed a legally transferring document but intentionally broke the horizontal underline beneath my name into 3 distinct separate dashes, it instantly communicated that I was signing under extreme duress. But it did much more than simply invalidate my consent. By using that specific distress signature on a property deed, the document legally transformed from a standard transfer of assets into a voluntary assumption of liability by the receiving party. I had just officially triggered the poison pill protocol. I did not just give Logan the deed to a pristine $5 million Dockland property. I gave him absolute, irrevocable legal responsibility for every single hidden nightmare attached to that land. Kendra thought she was walking out of this psychiatric facility with a golden ticket to pay off the mob. She had absolutely no idea that the piece of paper tucked under her arm was a financial suicide note. She had just forced her husband to voluntarily assume an apocalyptic level of corporate debt that they could never escape. They thought they had buried me in this white room, but they had just dug their own graves and I had happily handed them the shovels. Now I just had to wait for Logan's dangerous creditors to realize they were being played and for the mob to come knocking on my door. I did not have to wait long for the consequences of Logan's desperate financial games to catch up with him. Hours passed inside my sterile cell. The fluorescent lights overhead finally clicked off, replaced by a dim, yellowish nightlight embedded in the ceiling. It must have been well past midnight when the heavy deadbolt on my door suddenly disengaged with a sharp metallic clank. I sat up on the stiff mattress, fully expecting the night nurse to walk in with another dose of mandatory sedatives. Instead, the heavy steel door swung open to reveal 2 men who clearly did not belong in a medical facility. They stepped into the room, closing the door firmly behind them to block out the view from the hallway. They wore expensive, impeccably tailored dark suits that stretched tightly across their broad, muscular shoulders. The man in the front had a thick, scarred neck and cold, dead eyes that scanned the small room with professional efficiency. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick wad of cash, casually tossing it onto the small plastic table in the corner. He did not need to explain what the money was for. It was blatantly obvious they had heavily bribed the night shift orderly to look the other way and grant them unrestricted access to my room. The lead man pulled the single plastic chair from the corner, turned it backward, and sat down, resting his thick arms over the backrest. He looked at me with a terrifyingly calm expression. He introduced himself simply as a concerned business associate of my son-in-law. He explained that Logan owed his employers $3 million and the deadline for repayment had officially expired. Logan had been dodging their phone calls all day. When they finally tracked Logan down, my cowardly son-in-law had spun a frantic, desperate lie to save his own skin. Logan told the syndicate that I was the one holding up the payment. Logan claimed that I had gone completely insane, hidden all the liquid corporate assets in secret offshore accounts, and forced him to lock me in a psychiatric ward just to keep the business afloat. These men did not come to visit me out of sympathy. They came believing that I was a senile old man hiding their money. The man in the suit leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly whisper. He told me that I was going to give him the routing numbers to those offshore accounts right now. He promised that if I refused, they would simply wait until the hospital staff changed shifts, quietly transport me to a soundproof basement across town, and extract the information piece by piece until there was nothing left of me. I sat perfectly still on the edge of the bed. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. In my 40 years of building a commercial shipping empire, I have dealt with corrupt port authorities, ruthless union bosses, and international smugglers. I know exactly how to recognize a man who is willing to commit extreme violence. But I also know that men who deal in illicit finance care about one thing above all else. They care about their money. I straightened my posture, projecting the absolute authority of a CEO sitting at the head of a boardroom table. I looked the lead thug directly in the eye and spoke in a low, unwavering voice. "Logan is playing you for a fool," I said firmly. "He does not have your money and he never will. His tech company is a complete shell and he is entirely bankrupt." The man in the suit narrowed his eyes, his jaw tightening, but he did not interrupt me. I continued laying out the brutal reality of their situation. I explained that Logan had just left this very room hours ago with a transfer deed to a $5 million Dockland property. I watched the thug's eyes light up briefly with greedy recognition, knowing Logan had promised them that exact property as collateral. But then I dropped the hammer. I told him the deed Logan held was entirely worthless. I explained the poison pill protocol. I revealed that by forcing my signature under duress, Logan had legally assumed massive corporate liabilities that would completely freeze the asset the moment he tried to sell it. "Logan cannot pay you," I stated coldly. "He is buying time to pack his bags and flee the country, leaving you with an empty deed and a massive legal headache." The two men exchanged a quick, dark glance. They knew Logan was slippery, and my explanation fit perfectly with his desperate behavior over the last few weeks. I leaned forward, closing the distance between me and the lead enforcer. I offered them a mutually beneficial business proposition. "Get me out of this locked room right now," I demanded quietly. "Get me out of here. Give me access to my legal team, and I will hand you Logan on a silver platter." I promised them that if they helped me escape this illegal confinement, I would ensure Logan's entire fraudulent house of cards collapsed directly on top of him. I would provide them with exactly where Logan was hiding, where his secondary accounts were located, and the leverage they needed to strip him of everything he owned before he could run. The lead thug stared at me for a long, tense minute, weighing his options. He realized that torturing an old man in a psychiatric ward would draw massive federal heat and yield absolutely no cash. But an alliance with a billionaire shipping magnate who wanted to destroy their mutual enemy was an extremely profitable pivot. He stood up, kicking the plastic chair aside. "We have a deal," he grunted. "But if you are lying to me, old man, there is no hospital on earth that will be able to put you back together." He turned to his partner and nodded sharply toward the hallway. We could not simply walk out the front door. The facility was locked down and the main lobby was monitored by high-definition security cameras and armed security guards. We needed a diversion. The second thug stepped out of the room into the quiet corridor. He walked directly over to the wall-mounted fire alarm station, raised his heavy elbow, and violently smashed the protective glass. He pulled the red lever down hard. Instantly, the entire building erupted into absolute chaos. Deafening sirens blared through the overhead speakers, echoing painfully down the narrow corridors. Bright white strobe lights flashed aggressively, plunging the facility into a disorienting, terrifying panic. Nurses shouted over the noise, rushing out of break rooms to begin the emergency evacuation protocols. Patient doors were automatically unlocked by the central fire system to prevent anyone from being trapped. In the midst of the overwhelming confusion, the lead thug grabbed my arm and pulled me out into the hallway. I kept my head down, blending into the frantic crowd of staff and disoriented patients flooding toward the emergency exits. We bypassed the crowded main lobby entirely. The thugs navigated the complex layout with professional precision, leading me down a narrow service stairwell toward the rear delivery bays. We pushed through the heavy metal fire doors and spilled out into the freezing night air. A massive, black SUV with tinted windows was idling quietly near the loading docks. The rear door slid open. I climbed inside, sinking into the dark leather seats as the thugs jumped in front. The tires squealed against the asphalt as the heavy vehicle sped away from the facility, blending seamlessly into the late-night city traffic. Logan thought he had buried me alive. He had absolutely no idea that I had just crawled out of my own grave, backed by the very monsters he feared most. I was entirely off the grid. I was a ghost. The heavy black SUV tore through the city streets, putting miles between me and the psychiatric facility. The lead thug sitting in the passenger seat did not ask for my destination. I simply gave him the address of a rundown cash-only motel on the industrial outskirts of town. It was the kind of place that asked no questions and had absolutely no security cameras. When the vehicle finally rolled to a stop in the cracked asphalt parking lot, I stepped out into the damp night air. The thug rolled down his window, pointing a thick finger at me. He reminded me of our deal, warning me that if I did not deliver Logan, they would find me no matter where I hid. I told him to keep his phone on and wait for my signal. I walked into the flickering neon light of the motel office, paid for a room with the emergency cash I always kept hidden in my suit trousers, and locked myself inside room number 12. It smelled of stale smoke and damp carpet, but to me, it was a palace. I was free. I immediately used the room's landline to call Ethan. Within an hour, my lawyer arrived, carrying a heavy encrypted laptop and a briefcase full of mobile hotspots. He took one look at my wrinkled suit and the hospital grip socks still on my feet and let out a long breath, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. He quickly set up his equipment on the small, scratched wooden desk. It was early Saturday morning, but the financial world never truly sleeps if you know which back doors to use. Ethan pulled up a series of secure banking monitors and property registry portals. We sat in the dim light of the motel room, watching the digital footprint of my son-in-law's absolute greed. Thinking I was heavily sedated and securely locked away, Logan wasted no time. He immediately attempted to liquidate the Docklands. He listed the $5 million commercial property for a rapid fire sale price of exactly $4 million. He bypassed traditional real estate channels entirely, pushing the paperwork directly to his shady offshore buyer. He needed the cash wired before Monday morning to save his own life. We watched the transaction pending on the secure server. Logan was pushing for an expedited weekend escrow, a service that cost a fortune, but guaranteed immediate liquidity. He uploaded the transfer deed I had signed, fully expecting the offshore holding company to wire the $4 million directly into his empty corporate account. But Logan fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the people he was dealing with. Shady buyers looking for heavily discounted commercial real estate are entirely unethical, but they are never stupid. Before transferring millions of dollars across international borders, the buyer's legal team initiated a mandatory rapid background check on the property title. They accessed the county clerk's digital database to verify the deed was clear of encumbrances. That was when they hit the brick wall I had carefully constructed. The moment the buyer's lawyers scanned the digital copy of the deed, the county system flagged the flawed signature. The broken horizontal line beneath my name triggered an automatic irrevocable legal hold. The system officially registered the document not as a clean transfer of assets, but as a heavily disputed transfer signed under severe distress. The buyer's legal team immediately recognized the massive liability. Buying a property attached to a corporate distress signal meant inviting a federal investigation directly into their own offshore accounts. They pulled out instantly. Ethan's laptop screen flashed as the pending wire transfer was abruptly canceled. A moment later, Ethan played an intercepted audio file. Anticipating Logan's panic, Ethan had hired a private investigator to illegally tap Logan's cell phone the moment I went missing. The room filled with the sound of Logan screaming into his phone. He was verbally attacking the offshore broker, demanding to know why the funds had been pulled. The broker coldly informed Logan that the deed was functionally radioactive and permanently blocked from sale. Logan hurled his phone against the wall, the audio cutting out in a loud, violent crash. The property could not be sold to anyone, anywhere, at any price. The reality of his situation began to close in around Logan like a physical vice. He rushed to his home office, tearing through the legal copies of the deed, desperately trying to understand what had gone wrong. That was when he finally read the microscopic fine print I had embedded in the holding company documents years ago. Logan discovered that the pristine Dockland property was never actually owned free and clear by my liquid shipping company. It was structured as collateral for a massive, complex corporate holding trust. By eagerly claiming ownership of the property through a coerced signature, Logan did not inherit an asset he could quickly flip for cash. He had legally inherited the property exactly as it was structured. He had just voluntarily assumed a massive, unquantifiable liability that he was entirely unaware of until this exact moment. He was now the sole legal owner of a frozen piece of land that he could not sell, could not borrow against, and could not return. As Logan sat in his office hyperventilating and staring at the worthless papers, his backup cell phone rang. Ethan and I listened through the secondary tap. It was the lead thug from the black SUV. The mob enforcer did not yell. He spoke with the terrifying, quiet calm of a man who had already dug a grave. The thug informed Logan that they knew the property sale had completely fallen through. They knew he was entirely out of capital. The thug told Logan he had exactly 48 hours to produce the $3 million in untraceable cash. If the money was not delivered by Monday morning, they were not going to ask for it again. They were simply going to come to his house, and they were going to start with Kendra. The line went dead. Logan was trapped in a burning building of his own making, and I had just locked all the doors from the outside. The walls of Logan's immaculate home office suddenly felt like a shrinking cage. We listened through the secure audio tap as Logan paced frantically across the hardwood floor, his breathing ragged and shallow. The heavy thud of his footsteps was interrupted when the office door swung open. Kendra walked in, her voice sharp and demanding. She had heard the crash of the phone against the wall and wanted to know exactly what was going on. Logan could not hide the truth any longer. His polished, arrogant facade completely crumbled. He broke down, his voice cracking as he confessed everything to my daughter. He admitted that the tech startup was a total illusion and that he owed $3 million to a ruthless criminal syndicate. He told her about the terrifying phone call he had just received. The mob did not care about the frozen property deed or the legal complexities of the conservatorship. They wanted their money, and they had explicitly threatened to come after Kendra if the debt was not settled by Monday morning. The recording captured the chilling silence that followed his confession. Kendra finally realized the devastating reality of her situation. The luxurious life she thought she had secured was built on a foundation of lethal lies. The $5 million Dockland property she had so proudly stolen from me was completely unsellable, effectively a toxic wasteland of corporate liability. The business accounts were completely empty. They had absolutely zero cash, no sellable assets, and heavily armed men counting down the hours until they collected their debt in blood. Pure, unadulterated panic set in. Kendra started sobbing, blaming Logan for dragging her into this nightmare, while Logan yelled back, reminding her that she was the one who co-signed the original loans. They were two rats trapped in a sinking ship, tearing at each other in the dark. But desperation breeds a very specific kind of reckless criminality. As the reality of the 48-hour deadline loomed over them, survival instincts kicked in. They could not use my corporate assets, but I still had personal wealth. Logan remembered my primary residence, the sprawling multi-million-dollar colonial estate sitting on 2 acres of prime real estate. It was completely paid off. Logan immediately contacted a predatory private lender from his shady network. This was a financial shark who issued massive high-interest bridge loans with zero questions asked, provided there was unquestionable hard collateral. The lender agreed to front them $2 million in cash, immediately using my house as the guarantee. However, there was a massive legal hurdle. The temporary medical conservatorship a judge had granted Kendra explicitly prohibited the sale or mortgaging of my primary residence without a secondary comprehensive judicial review. A review like that would take weeks, and they only had hours. They needed the loan documents signed directly by me, the property owner, to bypass the family court restrictions. Since they believed I was securely locked away in a heavily sedated state, they made the most catastrophic decision of their lives. We listened as Logan placed the loan documents on their glass dining table. He told Kendra that the only way to save their lives was to forge my signature. Kendra did not hesitate. The woman I had raised, the daughter I had loved and protected, picked up a pen and began practicing my handwriting on scrap paper. She traced the loops and sharp angles of my signature until she had it perfected. Then, with steady hands driven by pure terror, she forged my name at the bottom of a $2 million fraudulent loan agreement. They scanned the forged documents and emailed them directly to the shadow lender, officially offering my family home to criminals. Back in the dimly lit motel room, the quiet hum of the air conditioner was suddenly interrupted by a sharp, piercing chime from Ethan's encrypted laptop. Ethan rapidly typed on his keyboard, pulling up a secure property monitoring portal he had attached to all of my personal assets. His face went completely pale in the glow of the screen. "Wesley," he said, his voice tight with alarm, "they just slapped a $2 million lien against your primary residence. A shadow bank just approved the bridge loan based on a direct signature." Ethan grabbed his cell phone, his fingers flying across the keypad. He told me he was calling the federal authorities immediately to file an emergency injunction and freeze the wire transfer before the criminals could drain the funds. I reached across the small wooden desk and placed my hand firmly over his, pushing the phone down. I looked at the pending transaction bar flashing green on the screen. "Do not stop it," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Let them take the money." Ethan stared at me like I had lost my mind, warning me that they were stealing the equity right out of my home. I smiled a cold, calculated expression that made my lawyer swallow hard. "Right now," I explained, "this is just a desperate plan. It is a state-level civil dispute. But the exact second that $2 million crosses state lines and hits Logan's bank account, this upgrades from a family court issue to federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. The FBI does not play games with bank fraud." I let go of Ethan's hand and leaned back in the cheap motel chair. "Let them dig the grave deeper," I told him. "Let them bury themselves so deep that they will never see the sunlight again." We sat in silence in the dim motel room, watching the glowing progress bar on Ethan's encrypted laptop. The digital clock in the corner of the screen ticked forward, marking the exact moment the shadow lender released the funds. The progress bar flashed bright green. $2 million officially dropped into Logan's primary checking account. They had done it. They had successfully committed a massive federal crime, leaving a pristine digital paper trail right back to their own living room. I gave Ethan a sharp nod. He did not waste a single second. He immediately opened a highly secure communication portal connected directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division. Ethan is not a man who waits on hold for a dispatcher. He typed out a direct urgent message to a senior special agent he had worked with on corporate fraud cases in the past. He attached the digital packet our private investigator had compiled. The packet included the forged loan document, the timestamps of the transaction, and the undeniable smoking gun, the IP address. When Kendra emailed that forged contract to the shadow bank, she used her home wireless network. Ethan's packet proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the fraudulent transmission originated directly from Logan and Kendra's personal router. By crossing state lines to defraud an institution for millions of dollars, they had instantly upgraded their desperate family court scam into a Class A federal felony. Aggravated identity theft and wire fraud carry mandatory federal prison sentences. Ethan hit the send button, submitting the emergency injunction request. The federal machine is notoriously slow, but when a prominent lawyer hands them a wrapped $2 million bank fraud case with undeniable IP evidence and an active money trail, they move with terrifying speed. Within 10 minutes, Ethan received a brief coded confirmation message from the special agent. The FBI had accepted the injunction. The trap had officially sprung, and its iron jaws had just clamped down hard on Logan's financial throat. Through the secondary audio tap, we listened to the exact moment Logan thought his life was saved. We could hear his heavy, frantic breathing as he sat at his computer desk refreshing his bank portal. When the $2 million balance appeared, he let out a loud, hysterical laugh of pure relief. He shouted for Kendra, telling her they were going to survive. He immediately opened the wire transfer window to send the funds directly to the criminal syndicate's offshore account. He hurriedly typed in the massive sum, his fingers striking the keyboard with heavy, desperate keystrokes. We heard the sharp click of the mouse as he hit the confirm button. Then the audio captured a harsh digital error chime from his computer speakers. Logan muttered a confused curse and clicked the button again. Another error chime rang out. He furiously hammered his mouse, refreshing the page. We listened as his relieved laughter rapidly morphed back into absolute panic. He grabbed his cell phone and dialed his bank's elite customer service line, screaming at the representative to manually push the wire transfer through immediately. The representative placed him on a brief hold. When she returned, her voice was completely devoid of customer service warmth. She coldly informed Logan that she could not assist him. She read from a prepared legal script stating that his account, along with every single financial asset attached to his social security number and business tax ID, had been globally frozen under a direct order from a federal law enforcement agency. Logan was stunned into absolute silence. He demanded to speak to a manager, but the representative simply advised him to retain criminal counsel and hung up the phone. The FBI had not just stopped the $2 million, they had initiated a total financial lockdown. Logan could not buy a cup of coffee, let alone pay off a mob syndicate. He was entirely cut off from the global financial system, leaving him utterly defenseless with the clock ticking relentlessly toward Monday morning. The realization of their total doom echoed through the audio tap as Logan collapsed onto his office floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Kendra realized that her husband was entirely broken and the money was locked away forever. The syndicate was going to come for her, and she had no cash to offer them. Driven by a raw, primal instinct to survive, she decided to scavenge. If she could not steal my money digitally, she would steal my physical assets. I knew she was calculating the value of my personal belongings. My estate was filled with expensive original artwork, antique silver, and high-end jewelry belonging to her late mother. She screamed at Logan to stay put, grabbed her purse, and sprinted out of their house. We tracked her phone's GPS as she drove recklessly across town, running red lights in a desperate frenzy to reach my home. She planned to strip the house bare, load her luxury SUV with everything of value, and pawn it all on the black market to buy herself a plane ticket out of the country. She arrived at my property and sprinted up the brick pathway to the heavy mahogany front door. She aggressively shoved the brass spare key into the deadbolt. It did not turn. She jiggled it frantically, cursing under her breath, pushing her entire body weight against the heavy wood. The door remained entirely unyielding. The locks had been professionally drilled out and completely replaced the moment she had driven me to the psychiatric facility. Confused and enraged, she finally stopped fighting the door and looked up. Taped directly at eye level on the beautiful dark wood was a bright yellow, legally binding notice. It was a formal eviction and trespassing warning. She read the bold black print, her eyes widening in sheer horror. The notice clearly stated that the property she was trying to enter was no longer owned by Wesley. Weeks ago, anticipating their ultimate betrayal, I had legally transferred the deed of my primary residence into an impenetrable, irrevocable blind trust managed by an aggressive, out-of-state legal firm. She had absolutely no legal right to be on the premises. She could not sell a house I no longer owned. She could not steal art from a trust. She stood on the front porch, completely locked out of the empire she thought she had conquered, staring at a piece of paper that proved I had been 10 steps ahead of her the entire time. She had absolutely nothing left to steal, nowhere to run, and the monsters she and her husband invited into their lives were already on their way. The reality of a federal investigation has a unique way of breaking a man's spirit. When you are facing angry investors or business rivals, you can negotiate, lie, or spin a clever narrative. But when the Federal Bureau of Investigation freezes your global assets for wire fraud and aggravated identity theft, charm becomes entirely useless. Pressure breaks the weak, and Logan was the weakest man I had ever known. By early Sunday morning, the crushing weight of his reality had completely fractured his loyalty to my daughter. He knew the criminal syndicate was coming for their money tomorrow, and he knew the federal government was already building a prison cell with his name on it. He could not outrun the mob, and he could not outsmart the FBI. He needed a life raft, and he was more than willing to drown his own wife to get one. While Kendra was locked in their master bedroom, desperately trying to figure out how to survive being locked out of my estate, Logan quietly slipped out the front door. He drove to a discreet, upscale diner on the opposite side of the city. We knew exactly where he went because Ethan's private investigator had been tracking his vehicle since the bank freeze. Logan was not meeting a friend or a financial backer. He was meeting with a highly expensive, aggressive criminal defense attorney. Through a secure feed, we listened as Logan laid out his desperate strategy. He was terrified, his voice shaking as he spoke to the lawyer over black coffee. He did not ask how to defend his family. He asked how to secure federal immunity for himself. Logan spun a masterful, cowardly web of lies. He told the attorney that the entire fraudulent scheme was Kendra's idea from the very beginning. He claimed she was the one who despised me. She was the one who orchestrated the medical conservatorship. And most importantly, she was the one who physically forged my signature on the $2 million loan documents. He painted himself as a terrified, innocent husband who was simply forced to go along with his wife's psychotic greed. He offered to become a cooperating witness for the federal prosecution. He explicitly stated he was willing to testify against Kendra in open court, handing them the exact evidence they needed to send her to federal prison for the next 20 years, as long as he walked away with a clean record. It was a staggering display of absolute betrayal. He was selling out the woman who had co-signed his loans and ruined her own life to save his. In the dim light of my motel room, I listened to the audio feed transmitted directly from the parabolic microphone our investigator had aimed at the diner window. The audio was crystal clear. Every cowardly word Logan spoke was recorded, digitized, and sent directly to Ethan's encrypted laptop. I sat there shaking my head slowly. I felt a brief, fleeting moment of sorrow for my daughter. I had warned her about Logan years ago. I had seen past his tailored suits and tech startup pitches to the hollow, spineless core beneath. But she had called me controlling and chosen him. Now she was about to pay the ultimate price for that choice. But I was not going to let Logan orchestrate this betrayal in secret. I wanted maximum destruction, and I wanted it to happen before we stepped into the courtroom on Monday morning. I instructed Ethan to isolate the exact audio clip where Logan explicitly offered to testify against Kendra. We cleaned up the background noise so his voice was undeniable. Then I used a secure, untraceable proxy server to draft a completely anonymous email. I attached the audio file and typed a very simple subject line: "Listen to your husband." I hit send, routing the email directly to Kendra's personal smartphone. I did not want to destroy them directly. I wanted them to destroy each other. I leaned back in my chair and waited for the explosion. Across town in their luxury apartment, Kendra was sitting on the living room floor surrounded by half-packed suitcases. She was still reeling from the shock of the eviction notice on my front door and the realization that they were completely trapped. Her phone chimed loudly on the glass coffee table. She reached out her hands, trembling, and opened the anonymous email. She tapped the audio file. Logan's voice immediately filled the quiet apartment, echoing off the high ceilings. She sat frozen, listening, as the man she loved, the man she had just committed a federal felony to protect, calmly offered to trade her life for his freedom. The audio clip ended, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. The front door handle suddenly rattled. Logan walked into the apartment carrying a paper cup of coffee and trying to force a reassuring smile onto his pale face. He started to tell her that he had been out looking for a solution, that he had a new plan to get them out of this mess. He did not get to finish his sentence. Kendra stood up from the floor, her eyes wide with a manic, murderous rage. She did not ask for an explanation. She picked up a heavy crystal vase from the table and hurled it directly at his head. It shattered against the wall behind him, raining glass across the hardwood floor. A furious, violent argument erupted. We could hear the screaming through Logan's tapped phone. Kendra called him a coward, a traitor, and a parasite. She told him she had heard the recording. Logan panicked, his voice rising in high-pitched defense as he realized his secret exit strategy was exposed. Their alliance, built entirely on greed and entitlement, completely shattered into a million pieces. They were no longer partners in crime. They were bitter enemies trapped in a burning room. The timing was absolutely perfect. Tomorrow morning was the final mandatory family court hearing to make the temporary conservatorship permanent. They were going to have to walk into that courtroom together, hating each other, terrified of the mob, and completely unaware of the final devastating trap I had waiting for them. The heavy mahogany doors of the family court swung shut behind me, sealing the courtroom in a tense, solemn silence. It was Monday morning. I walked into the courthouse through the private rear entrance, accompanied by Ethan and a small detail of private security. We took our seats in the very back row, remaining completely hidden in the shadows, entirely out of sight from the petitioner's table. At the front of the grand courtroom, Kendra and Logan sat shoulder to shoulder next to their highly expensive family lawyer. Watching them from a distance, I was genuinely repulsed by their masterful theatrical performance. Despite the vicious glass-shattering fight that had completely torn their marriage apart less than 24 hours ago, they were putting on a united front for the judge. Kendra was dressed in a conservative dark navy suit, continuously dabbing her dry eyes with a crumpled tissue. She played the role of the exhausted, heartbroken daughter to absolute perfection. She kept leaning her head against Logan's shoulder, acting as though she needed his physical support just to remain sitting upright in her chair. Logan, wearing his best tailored suit, played the stoic, deeply concerned son-in-law. He gently patted her hand, projecting a flawless image of unwavering familial devotion. I knew exactly what they were hiding behind those fake tears. They absolutely despised each other. Logan had spent yesterday morning trying to sell her out to the federal government to secure his own immunity, and Kendra had nearly taken his head off with a heavy crystal vase, but pure greed and sheer terror had temporarily glued them back together. They were entirely out of time. The criminal syndicate was expecting their $3 million payment today, and their federal assets were entirely frozen by the FBI. This courtroom was their absolute last hope. They needed the judge to make the temporary conservatorship permanent so they could somehow leverage my remaining estate to escape the apocalyptic nightmare closing in on them. The bailiff called the court to order. The Honorable Judge Carter, a stern-looking man with decades of legal experience, took his seat at the high wooden bench. The final act of their desperate play was about to officially begin. Kendra's attorney stood up, straightening his silk tie, and began weaving a beautifully tragic narrative for the court. He spoke with grave concern about my severely declining mental health. He told the judge that after a terrifying incident involving left-on gas stoves and spoiled food, I had been placed in a secure psychiatric facility for my own protection. However, the lawyer claimed in my severely confused and paranoid state, I had somehow managed to escape the hospital over the weekend and was currently missing. The lawyer painted me as a helpless, wandering old man who was completely incapable of protecting his own vast financial empire. To prove that Kendra and Logan were responsible, proactive guardians who were stepping up during a massive family crisis, the lawyer approached the bench with a thick stack of documents. He proudly submitted the signed deed to the $5 million commercial Dockland property. He presented it as absolute proof that I had willingly initiated the transfer of my business assets to Logan's holding company right before my mental break, and that they were simply executing my final lucid wishes. But they did not stop there. The lawyer then submitted the paperwork for the $2 million bridge loan. He lied straight to the judge's face, claiming that my business accounts were dangerously overdrawn due to my severe financial mismanagement. He told the court that Kendra had bravely secured this high-interest loan against my personal estate just to keep my shipping company afloat and pay my loyal employees. They were actively trying to legitimize their massive federal fraud by wrapping it in the protective blanket of a family court ruling. They wanted the judge to retroactively bless their illegal actions, turning their desperate theft into court-mandated estate management. Sitting in the back row, I watched Logan's shoulders visibly relax as the judge flipped through the documents. Kendra offered a tearful, wobbly smile to the bench. They thought their fabricated paper trail was completely flawless. They genuinely believed that because I was supposedly missing, there was absolutely no one in the room who could challenge the authenticity of their narrative. They thought they had successfully manipulated the legal system to validate their hostile takeover. Judge Carter adjusted his reading glasses, carefully reviewing the submitted property deed and the complex bridge loan paperwork. The courtroom was dead silent, save for the rustling of the thick parchment paper. After several long minutes, the judge nodded slowly. He looked down at Kendra with a deeply sympathetic expression. He announced that given my sudden disappearance and the clear documented evidence of massive financial transactions that needed immediate oversight, he was fully prepared to grant the petition. He reached for his heavy wooden gavel, ready to officially strike down my independence and make the temporary conservatorship permanent. Logan let out a sharp, audible exhale of pure relief. Kendra closed her eyes, clutching her hands tightly to her chest in a theatrical display of overwhelming gratitude. They thought they had crossed the finish line. They thought they had won. That is exactly when Ethan Hayes stood up from the back row. His voice cut through the quiet courtroom like a sharp crack of thunder. "Objection, Your Honor," Ethan stated loudly, his tone echoing off the high-paneled walls. The judge paused, his wooden gavel hovering in midair. He looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion as Ethan confidently walked down the center aisle. Ethan formally introduced himself as my primary corporate and personal counsel. Kendra and Logan snapped their heads around, the blood instantly draining from their faces. Their eyes widened in absolute terror as they stared at Ethan, realizing that my lawyer was here and completely prepared to fight. But Ethan did not move to strike the fraudulent documents from the record. He did not accuse them of theft. He did not yell or demand an immediate arrest. Instead, he stopped right in front of the judge's bench, buttoned his suit jacket, and smiled warmly. "Your Honor," Ethan said smoothly, projecting his voice so everyone in the room could hear every single word. "We do not contest their claim to the commercial Dockland property. We do not contest the bridge loan. In fact, we are absolutely thrilled that they have formally and legally claimed ownership of these assets on the public court record." The heavy mahogany doors of the family court swung shut behind me, sealing the courtroom in a tense, solemn silence. It was Monday morning. I walked into the courthouse through the private rear entrance, accompanied by Ethan and a small detail of private security. We took our seats in the very back row, remaining completely hidden in the shadows, entirely out of sight from the petitioner's table. At the front of the grand courtroom, Kendra and Logan sat shoulder to shoulder next to their highly expensive family lawyer. Watching them from a distance, I was genuinely repulsed by their masterful theatrical performance. Despite the vicious glass-shattering fight that had completely torn their marriage apart less than 24 hours ago, they were putting on a united front for the judge. Kendra was dressed in a conservative dark navy suit, continuously dabbing her dry eyes with a crumpled tissue. She played the role of the exhausted, heartbroken daughter to absolute perfection. She kept leaning her head against Logan's shoulder, acting as though she needed his physical support just to remain sitting upright in her chair. Logan, wearing his best tailored suit, played the stoic, deeply concerned son-in-law. He gently patted her hand, projecting a flawless image of unwavering familial devotion. I knew exactly what they were hiding behind those fake tears. They absolutely despised each other. Logan had spent yesterday morning trying to sell her out to the federal government to secure his own immunity, and Kendra had nearly taken his head off with a heavy crystal vase. But pure greed and sheer terror had temporarily glued them back together. They were entirely out of time. The criminal syndicate was expecting their $3 million payment today, and their federal assets were entirely frozen by the FBI. This courtroom was their absolute last hope. They needed the judge to make the temporary conservatorship permanent so they could somehow leverage my remaining estate to escape the apocalyptic nightmare closing in on them. The bailiff called the court to order. The Honorable Judge Carter, a stern-looking man with decades of legal experience, took his seat at the high wooden bench. The final act of their desperate play was about to officially begin. Kendra's attorney stood up, straightening his silk tie, and began weaving a beautifully tragic narrative for the court. He spoke with grave concern about my severely declining mental health. He told the judge that after a terrifying incident involving left-on gas stoves and spoiled food, I had been placed in a secure psychiatric facility for my own protection. However, the lawyer claimed in my severely confused and paranoid state, I had somehow managed to escape the hospital over the weekend and was currently missing. The lawyer painted me as a helpless, wandering old man who was completely incapable of protecting his own vast financial empire. To prove that Kendra and Logan were responsible, proactive guardians who were stepping up during a massive family crisis, the lawyer approached the bench with a thick stack of documents. He proudly submitted the signed deed to the $5 million commercial Dockland property. He presented it as absolute proof that I had willingly initiated the transfer of my business assets to Logan's holding company right before my mental break, and that they were simply executing my final lucid wishes. But they did not stop there. The lawyer then submitted the paperwork for the $2 million bridge loan. He lied straight to the judge's face, claiming that my business accounts were dangerously overdrawn due to my severe financial mismanagement. He told the court that Kendra had bravely secured this high-interest loan against my personal estate just to keep my shipping company afloat and pay my loyal employees. They were actively trying to legitimize their massive federal fraud by wrapping it in the protective blanket of a family court ruling. They wanted the judge to retroactively bless their illegal actions, turning their desperate theft into court-mandated estate management. Sitting in the back row, I watched Logan's shoulders visibly relax as the judge flipped through the documents. Kendra offered a tearful, wobbly smile to the bench. They thought their fabricated paper trail was completely flawless. They genuinely believed that because I was supposedly missing, there was absolutely no one in the room who could challenge the authenticity of their narrative. They thought they had successfully manipulated the legal system to validate their hostile takeover. Judge Carter adjusted his reading glasses carefully, reviewing the submitted property deed and the complex bridge loan paperwork. The courtroom was dead silent save for the rustling of the thick parchment paper. After several long minutes, the judge nodded slowly. He looked down at Kendra with a deeply sympathetic expression. He announced that given my sudden disappearance and the clear documented evidence of massive financial transactions that needed immediate oversight, he was fully prepared to grant the petition. He reached for his heavy wooden gavel, ready to officially strike down my independence and make the temporary conservatorship permanent. Logan let out a sharp, audible exhale of pure relief. Kendra closed her eyes, clutching her hands tightly to her chest in a theatrical display of overwhelming gratitude. They thought they had crossed the finish line. They thought they had won. That is exactly when Ethan Hayes stood up from the back row. His voice cut through the quiet courtroom like a sharp crack of thunder. "Objection, Your Honor," Ethan stated loudly, his tone echoing off the high paneled walls. The judge paused, his wooden gavel hovering in midair. He looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion as Ethan confidently walked down the center aisle. Ethan formally introduced himself as my primary corporate and personal counsel. Kendra and Logan snapped their heads around, the blood instantly draining from their faces. Their eyes widened in absolute terror as they stared at Ethan, realizing that my lawyer was here and completely prepared to fight. But Ethan did not move to strike the fraudulent documents from the record. He did not accuse them of theft. He did not yell or demand an immediate arrest. Instead, he stopped right in front of the judge's bench, buttoned his suit jacket, and smiled warmly. "Your Honor," Ethan said smoothly, projecting his voice so everyone in the room could hear every single word. "We do not contest their claim to the commercial Dockland property. We do not contest the bridge loan. In fact, we are absolutely thrilled that they have formally and legally claimed ownership of these assets on the public court record." The courtroom remained entirely silent, the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that precedes a massive explosion. Judge Carter lowered his gavel slowly, his thick eyebrows knitting together in profound confusion. He looked at Ethan, then down at the documents and back to Ethan. Kendra and Logan exchanged a rapid, bewildered glance. For a fleeting fraction of a second, a spark of hope actually ignited in Logan's eyes. He genuinely believed Ethan was surrendering. He thought I had simply given up the fight to protect my public reputation from a messy family trial. Logan even let out a small, arrogant scoff, adjusting his suit jacket and sitting up a little straighter in his chair. But Ethan did not return to his seat. Instead, he picked up a single, pristine white folder from his briefcase and approached the judge's bench with slow, deliberate steps. He asked the judge for permission to submit an emergency addendum regarding the exact nature of the Dockland property that Logan and Kendra were so proudly claiming. Judge Carter nodded, accepting the thin white folder. Ethan turned to face the courtroom, locking eyes directly with my son-in-law. He began to speak in a calm, analytical tone that sliced through the tension like a scalpel. He explained the hidden history of the Dockland property. 20 years ago, long before I built my shipping empire into what it is today, that specific parcel of waterfront land was leased to a massive industrial chemical manufacturing plant. For decades, it was heavily polluted, acting as a quiet, illegal dumping site for highly toxic industrial waste. When the plant went bankrupt, I bought the land at a remarkably steep discount. I was fully aware of the environmental risks, so I immediately sealed the entire contaminated acreage under several feet of thick military-grade concrete. For 20 years, I used the property merely as a secure parking and storage lot for my massive fleet of transport trucks. It was perfectly legal and safe as long as the concrete remained entirely intact. Ethan paused, letting the history lesson sink in before dropping the absolute payload. He turned back to the judge and instructed him to look at the second page of the white folder. Last month, Ethan continued, his voice rising in volume and authority. The Environmental Protection Agency conducted a sweeping, unannounced structural review of the city's commercial waterfront. They brought ground-penetrating radar and chemical engineers. They discovered that the 20-year-old concrete seal on my property was severely degrading due to saltwater erosion. The toxic chemicals were dangerously close to leaking into the public water supply. The EPA did not ask for a meeting. They did not issue a warning. They immediately issued a mandatory, non-negotiable environmental cleanup order. Kendra frowned clearly, not grasping the severity of the situation. Logan, however, went entirely rigid. His background in failed corporate startups meant he understood the terrifying power of federal regulatory agencies. Ethan looked at the ceiling, pretending to calculate a number he already knew by heart. The immediate fine, combined with the estimated cost of the mandatory hazardous waste removal and soil replacement, totaled exactly $7 million. A collective gasp rippled through the few court clerks and bailiffs in the room. $7 million in unforgivable federal debt. And the most beautiful part of federal environmental law is its absolute uncompromising rigidity. Ethan looked dead at Logan and smiled. The EPA fine is not attached to the defunct chemical company that caused the pollution. It is not attached to the previous owner of the land. The federal government attaches the $7 million liability strictly, entirely, and exclusively to the current legal holder of the property deed. The realization hit Logan like a freight train. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Ethan broke down the exact, inescapable legal trap they had just willingly locked themselves inside. By bypassing traditional real estate lawyers, by hiring thugs to lock me in a psychiatric ward, and by forcing me to sign that specific transfer deed under extreme duress, They thought they were stealing a pristine, sellable $5 million asset. But because they failed to notice my secret distress signature, the deed had legally transferred as an assumption of liability. Furthermore, they could not claim it was a private mistake or an unfinalized transaction. By marching into a court of law this very morning and proudly submitting that exact deed to the judge as undeniable proof of their proactive legal ownership, they had just cemented their fate on the permanent public record. They could not claim ignorance. They could not give the property back to me. They had officially, permanently, and legally assumed a $7 million debt to the United States federal government. They had taken the bait, swallowed the hook, and dragged themselves straight to the bottom of the ocean. Ethan laid out the catastrophic math for the entire courtroom to hear. When you combine the $7 million EPA fine with the $2 million bridge loan they had fraudulently secured against my home and the $3 million they already owed to the violent criminal syndicate, their total immediate liability was a staggering $12 million. They had absolutely zero liquid assets to cover even a fraction of it. The FBI had already frozen Logan's bank accounts, meaning they could not even hire a lawyer to try and fight the EPA. They were financially annihilated. They were entirely bankrupt, buried under a mountain of debt that could never be discharged or forgiven. Logan could not process the magnitude of his destruction. His chest began to heave violently as he gasped for air, his hands clutching desperately at the lapels of his expensive suit. The panic attack hit him with such intense physical force that his eyes rolled back in his head. He let out a pathetic wheezing choke, slumped sideways, and physically collapsed out of his chair, hitting the hard courtroom floor in a crumpled heap. Kendra did not even reach down to help her husband. The realization of her own absolute ruin shattered her carefully constructed facade of the weeping, concerned daughter. She jumped up from her chair, her face contorted in a mask of unhinged, venomous fury. She whipped her head around, scanning the back rows until her eyes locked directly onto me, sitting in the shadows. She pointed a shaking finger at me, screaming at the top of her lungs, entirely ignoring the judge's heavy gavel banging for order. "You planned this," she shrieked, her voice echoing hysterically. "You set us up. You tricked us into taking that toxic dump. You knew exactly what you were doing." The bailiffs immediately stepped forward, placing their hands on their utility belts, ready to restrain her. But Ethan did not flinch. He stood tall in the center of the courtroom, staring down at my frantic, screaming daughter with an expression of absolute freezing disdain. He did not yell. He simply used her own lawyer's opening statement as the final nail in her coffin. "You claimed in court just 10 minutes ago that you forced this property transfer to protect your father," Ethan pointed out calmly, his voice easily carrying over her hysterical sobbing. "You stated on the public record that you were selflessly saving his business from financial ruin. Well, congratulations, Kendra. You successfully protected him from a massive federal bankruptcy by voluntarily taking the entire toxic burden upon yourselves. Your father is entirely debt-free, and you are the proud owners of a $7 million radioactive wasteland." The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block with a violent, deafening crack that echoed through the high ceilings of the courtroom. Judge Carter was practically out of his seat, his face flushed with a mixture of absolute outrage and sheer disbelief. He ordered Kendra to remain silent or face immediate detention for contempt of court. Kendra abruptly stopped screaming, her chest heaving as she stared at the judge with wild, panicked eyes. She was slowly realizing that her carefully constructed narrative of the concerned, loving daughter had just been entirely incinerated on the public record. But Ethan Hayes was not finished. He had systematically dismantled their financial future, and now it was time to completely obliterate their freedom. Ethan remained perfectly composed at the center podium. He looked up at the angry judge and requested permission to submit one final piece of evidence to the court. He stated that this evidence would officially clarify the exact circumstances of my supposed disappearance and definitively prove that I was never a wandering, senile old man. Judge Carter gave a sharp, tense nod. Ethan reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small, encrypted USB drive. He handed it to the court clerk, instructing her to plug it into the courtroom's central audio system. The entire room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence as the clerk clicked a few buttons on her computer. A second later, a sharp burst of static hissed through the overhead speakers, followed by the undeniable sound of a rumbling vehicle engine. It was the audio file from the micro-recorder hidden in my shoe. The courtroom listened in absolute horror as the recorded voices of Kendra and Logan filled the large room. The audio was crystal clear. Logan's frantic voice echoed off the wood-paneled walls, asking if the dosage the private medic administered was enough to keep me locked away until Monday. Then Kendra's chilling, heartless response played for everyone to hear. She confidently assured him that I would be completely incapacitated for at least 48 hours, and that they were going to use that time to finalize the theft of my $5 million Dockland property to pay off the mob. The color completely drained from the faces of Kendra's expensive legal team. Her lead attorney physically took a step away from her, realizing he had just been used to facilitate a massive organized criminal conspiracy. Judge Carter sat frozen behind the bench, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in his cheeks twitched. He was a veteran of the family court system, a man who had seen bitter divorces and greedy inheritance disputes. But this was an entirely different level of depravity. He had just listened to undeniable proof that the petitioner sitting in his courtroom had hired unlicensed thugs to physically assault, drug, and kidnap an elderly man from his own front porch. They had forcibly locked me in an illegal psychiatric hold and then marched into a federal building to commit perjury in an attempt to steal my commercial empire. The audio recording clicked off, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in the courtroom. Kendra was hyperventilating, her hands covering her mouth as she stared at the speakers in sheer terror. She knew there was absolutely no defense against her own recorded words. Judge Carter did not ask for closing arguments. He did not ask Kendra's lawyer for a rebuttal. He slammed his gavel down with such force that the heavy wooden handle nearly splintered. He announced in a booming, furious voice that the petition for a permanent medical and financial conservatorship was immediately denied with extreme prejudice. He then officially revoked the temporary conservatorship that had been granted over the weekend, declaring it obtained through gross fraud and malicious perjury. But the judge was far from done. He looked directly at Kendra and Logan, his eyes burning with absolute judicial rage. "You have made a mockery of this court," he thundered, pointing a heavy finger at the defense table. "You used the legal system as a weapon to facilitate kidnapping, extortion, and grand larceny against your own flesh and blood. You are a disgrace." Judge Carter immediately looked over to the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom and gave a sharp, decisive nod. The doors swung open. 2 local police officers, accompanied by 2 federal agents in dark suits whom Ethan had been coordinating with since the wire fraud was detected, stepped into the courtroom. They moved down the center aisle with swift, purposeful strides. Logan was still crumpled on the floor, groaning in a pathetic, semi-conscious state after his panic attack. 2 large officers grabbed him by the arms, hauling his limp body up from the carpet. Logan tried to weakly protest his expensive suit now wrinkled and covered in dust. He stammered, begging them to listen to him, but the officers were entirely unmoved. They forcefully yanked his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed loudly across the quiet room. The federal agent coldly read Logan his Miranda rights, informing him that he was being placed under immediate arrest for conspiracy to commit kidnapping, aggravated identity theft, and federal wire fraud. Logan began to openly weep, his polished tech executive persona entirely shattered as he was roughly escorted toward the back exit. As Logan was dragged away in handcuffs, the reality of the situation finally crashed down on Kendra. She was completely out of options, out of money, and about to be out of time. The second federal agent stepped toward her, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. Pure primal survival instinct took over. Kendra scrambled away from her defense table, pushing past her stunned lawyer. She ran directly toward the low wooden barrier that separated the court well from the public gallery. She looked into the shadows of the back row where I was sitting and threw herself forward, dropping hard to her knees against the wooden gate. Her designer dress caught on the floor, but she did not care. The theatrical fake tears she had used to manipulate the judge were gone, replaced by raw, ugly sobs of absolute terror. "Dad, please," she screamed, her voice cracking as she reached her shaking hands out toward me. "Please do not let them do this to me. I am so sorry." It was all Logan's idea. He forced me to do it. He threatened me. She was frantically throwing the husband she had conspired with completely under the bus, hoping to find a shred of the unconditional paternal love she had spent her entire life exploiting. "I will divorce him today," she begged, tears streaming down her ruined makeup. "I will sign whatever you want. Just tell them to let me go. I am still your little girl. Please, Daddy, save me." I slowly stood up from the wooden bench in the back row. I walked out of the shadows and approached the barrier where my daughter was kneeling on the floor, begging for her life. I looked down at her. I expected to feel a twinge of heartbreak. I expected to feel the familiar heavy burden of a father's duty to protect his child. But as I stared into her desperate, terrified eyes, I felt absolutely nothing. The deep well of love and sacrifice I had held for her had completely dried up the moment I saw her hand Logan the yellow spare key to my home. I adjusted the cuffs of my suit jacket, my expression completely blank, devoid of anger or pity. I did not raise my voice. I spoke in a quiet, steady tone that only she could hear. "You are not my little girl anymore," I said coldly. "You chose your path. Now you have a $7 million debt to pay and a federal prison sentence to serve." I turned around and began walking toward the courtroom exit, leaving her completely behind. "You made your bed, Kendra," I added without looking back. "Now lie in it." The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom closed firmly behind me, completely shutting out the pathetic, echoing sounds of my daughter's frantic weeping. Stepping out into the crisp afternoon air felt like drawing my first real breath in weeks. By the time my private security detail escorted me down the courthouse steps and into the back of my waiting vehicle, the local news stations had already caught wind of the spectacular legal implosion. A high-profile tech executive being hauled out of a family court hearing in federal handcuffs is not a story that stays quiet for long. Within hours, the narrative had exploded. Logan's panicked, tear-stained mugshot was plastered across every major news network, digital financial blog, and social media platform in the city. The sensational headlines screamed of massive wire fraud, elder abuse, forced institutionalization, and the spectacular, catastrophic collapse of his hollow tech empire. The public devoured the scandalous downfall of a local elite, but a very specific, highly dangerous group of men was watching the evening broadcast with cold, calculating fury. The criminal syndicate that Logan had borrowed $3 million from did not care about the federal charges, the public humiliation, or the environmental fines. They only cared about their capital. Seeing Logan locked securely behind the impenetrable concrete walls of a federal holding facility, knowing that his global assets had been entirely frozen by the FBI, they realized instantly that he was a dead end. He could not be intimidated or tortured for funds he could no longer access. He was completely useless to them now. But this syndicate was not in the business of writing off bad debts. They operated on a foundation of absolute terrifying ruthlessness. If the primary borrower was permanently eliminated from the board, they simply shifted their crosshairs to the next available target. And Logan, in his arrogant stupidity, had provided them with the perfect secondary victim. He had allowed his wife to co-sign the original unregulated loans. While Logan spent his first night shivering on a hard steel cot in federal lockup, Kendra returned to their sprawling luxury apartment alone. She was completely terrified, exhausted, and financially exposed. She truly thought she had hit absolute rock bottom on the courtroom floor, but the real nightmare was just beginning. At exactly 6 o'clock the following morning, the syndicate did not send men in leather jackets with baseball bats. They were much smarter and far more efficient than that. They sent a team of aggressive, highly paid collection attorneys representing the shadow bank, backed by a crew of private repossession agents. Because Kendra had legally attached her name and social security number to the $3 million debt, the syndicate used their legitimate front companies to execute a total, merciless asset seizure. Kendra was violently awakened by the sound of her front door being legally breached by the building superintendent. The repossession team swarmed her apartment like locusts. They did not ask for permission or offer any explanations. The lead attorney simply handed her a thick stack of court-approved collection orders and began stripping her entire life bare. They confiscated the keys to her luxury SUV and Logan's leased sports car, towing both vehicles out of the underground parking garage before she could even put on her shoes. They forced her to open her personal wall safe, systematically seizing every piece of designer jewelry, expensive watches, and even the diamond wedding ring off her finger to satisfy the massive debt. Her personal bank accounts, the few that had not already been locked down by the federal investigation, were instantly drained to zero by automated collection levies. She stood in the center of her massive living room, weeping hysterically and begging them to stop as men in dark work shirts carried away her expensive Italian furniture, her designer clothes, and her high-end electronics. Within 2 brutal hours, she was legally evicted from the property, as the apartment itself was listed as collateral for another one of Logan's failed shell companies. She was unceremoniously escorted out of the building by private security. She stood on the cold city sidewalk, shivering in the crisp morning air. She had no car, no money, no home, and literally nothing to her name but the casual clothes on her back and a dead cell phone clutched in her trembling hands. Desperation is a cruel and demanding master. Stripped of her wealth, her arrogant pride, and her protective husband Kendra wandered the city streets for hours until she finally found a public library. She sat down at a free computer terminal, logged into her social media accounts, and desperately tried to contact anyone who could rescue her from the streets. She reached out to the affluent friends she used to host lavish brunch parties with, begging for a place to crash for a few nights or a small loan to get back on her feet. They all read her messages. Not a single one replied. The extreme toxicity of her federal scandal, combined with the terrifying rumors of mob involvement, made her an absolute social pariah overnight. Out of options, she finally swallowed the last bitter drop of her pride and used the library phone to call my younger sister, her Aunt Valerie. Kendra sobbed into the receiver, pleading for family loyalty. She claimed she was a helpless victim of Logan's cruel manipulation and my vindictive rage. She begged her aunt to come pick her up, but Aunt Valerie did not offer a warm bed, a hot meal, or a sympathetic ear. Her voice came through the line like absolute ice. Valerie told Kendra to never call her number again. What my daughter did not know was that immediately after I escaped the psychiatric ward, I had invited our entire extended family and our closest mutual friends to a private meeting at my lawyer's office. I did not just tell them what Kendra had done to me. I showed them. I played the crystal clear audio of her plotting to drug me and steal my empire. I showed them the high-definition security footage of her handing Logan the key to trash my house. I exposed the absolute monstrous reality of exactly who she had become. I had methodically and deliberately burned every single bridge she could ever hope to cross. Kendra stood alone in the bustling city, surrounded by millions of people but entirely isolated from humanity. The doors to her old life, to her family, and to her future were permanently locked, and I held the only key. The dust settled quickly after the dramatic collapse of my daughter's life. With the immediate threat of the criminal syndicate neutralized by the FBI's sweeping asset freeze and the family court petition formally dismissed with extreme prejudice, it was time to rebuild my empire. I sat in Ethan Hayes' secure downtown office, sipping a glass of expensive aged bourbon as we executed the final phase of our financial strategy. I authorized the immediate repatriation of my liquid assets from the Cayman Islands Trust. Millions of dollars flowed seamlessly back into my domestic corporate accounts, instantly reviving the empty shell I had created to trap Logan. My shipping logistics company did not just survive the attempted hostile takeover, it absolutely flourished. Without Logan constantly sniffing around for handouts and attempting to leverage my business connections to prop up his fraudulent startup, my executive team operated with a renewed sense of absolute focus. We secured 3 major international freight contracts in the following quarter, pushing our profit margins to record highs. My loyal employees, who had stood strong when Logan's hired thugs tried to intimidate them at the loading docks, received massive year-end bonuses. Meanwhile, the federal justice system moved with a terrifying efficiency against the man who had tried to destroy me. Logan's federal trial was remarkably brief and utterly humiliating. His highly paid criminal defense attorney tried to spin a desperate narrative of a confused businessman making a momentary lapse in judgment under extreme financial pressure. But the federal prosecutors absolutely buried him. They played the crystal clear audio of his attempted extortion and his calculated plan to lock me away. They presented the undeniable digital footprint of the wire fraud originating directly from his personal internet router. The judge was completely unmoved by Logan's tearful apologies and pathetic pleas for mercy. Logan was formally sentenced to 8 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. There would be no early parole, no country club prison accommodations, and absolutely no leniency. He was stripped of his tailored designer suits and handed a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The polished, arrogant tech executive was permanently erased, replaced by a federal inmate number. The men he owed money to were currently being hunted by the authorities, but Logan would spend the next 8 years looking over his shoulder in the prison yard, knowing he could never truly outrun his debts. Kendra faced a completely different yet equally devastating kind of prison on the outside. The federal government does not simply forget about a $7 million environmental hazard. Because she and Logan had officially claimed ownership of the toxic Dockland property on the public court record, the Environmental Protection Agency aggressively pursued her for the cleanup costs. With her bank accounts completely drained by the Shadow Syndicate and her luxury assets legally repossessed, She had absolutely no way to pay even a fraction of the massive fine. She was forced to hire a cheap public defender and file for absolute bankruptcy. But filing for bankruptcy does not magically erase the crushing reality of having zero income and a completely destroyed reputation. Environmental fines of that magnitude are notoriously difficult to discharge, leaving a permanent black mark on her record. With her social circle entirely evaporated and her family completely cutting her off, Kendra had to face the brutal reality of survival for the very first time in her pampered life. The woman who used to loudly complain to restaurant managers if her luxury SUV was not detailed properly was forced to take the only job that would accept someone with her highly publicized toxic background. She found employment at a rundown, greasy diner on the industrial outskirts of the city. She was handed a cheap polyester uniform, a name tag, and a minimum wage salary. Her days were no longer spent browsing high-end designer boutiques or attending upscale brunch parties with wealthy housewives. They were spent scrubbing sticky tables, carrying heavy plastic trays of cheap food, and enduring the rude demands of impatient truck drivers and construction workers. She was living paycheck to paycheck, counting loose change just to afford the monthly rent on a tiny, cramped studio apartment in a dangerous neighborhood. Her delicate hands, once manicured every week, became calloused and burned from the harsh dishwashing chemicals. Late one Tuesday afternoon, a heavy cold rain washed over the city streets. I was sitting in the plush leather backseat of my chauffeur-driven Bentley, returning home from a highly successful corporate board meeting. As we navigated the gray, waterlogged avenues, we happened to stop at a long red light directly across from the diner where Kendra worked. I told my driver to pull over to the curb and leave the engine running. I looked through the thick, rain-streaked tinted glass. The bright neon open sign of the diner flickered erratically in the gloomy afternoon light. Through the large front window, I clearly saw my daughter. She was wearing a stained brown apron, her hair tied back in a messy, careless knot. She was leaning heavily against a corner booth, vigorously scrubbing a spilled cup of coffee off the cheap laminate table with a gray rag. She looked incredibly thin, utterly exhausted, and completely broken. The arrogant, triumphant sneer she had worn when she demanded my signature in that psychiatric facility was entirely gone. It was replaced by the hollow, defeated stare of a woman who had finally realized the true, inescapable cost of her own greed. I watched her wipe her forehead with the back of her hand, visibly wincing from the physical labor as she picked up a heavy tray of dirty dishes. I did not smile. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindictive joy or an urge to step out of my luxury vehicle to gloat. The war was over and the battlefield was completely silent. I simply stared at the stranger she had become, accepting the absolute finality of my decision. I pressed the silver button on the door panel. The thick, soundproof window smoothly rolled up completely, cutting off the sound of the pouring rain and the depressing sight of the diner. I instructed my driver to head home, leaving her behind in the exact life she had actively chosen to build. The drive back from the diner was quiet, the heavy rain drumming a steady, rhythmic beat against the Bentley's roof. It felt like an applause from nature washing away the last remnants of a bitter, exhausting war. I pulled through the heavy wrought iron gates of my colonial estate, the exact same estate Logan and Kendra had desperately tried to steal out from under me to pay their criminal debts. The heavy deadbolt engaged with a satisfying metallic clunk behind me as I stepped into the grand foyer. My home was impeccably quiet. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of that locked psychiatric cell where they had abandoned me. It was the warm, golden silence of absolute security and total control. I walked slowly into the formal dining room, my footsteps echoing faintly against the polished Brazilian hardwood. I moved deliberately to the custom mahogany wine cabinet built into the far wall. I bypassed the everyday bottles and reached for a very specific vintage resting horizontally on the top shelf. It was the exact same expensive, robust red wine Logan had so eagerly poured for me on that fateful Thursday night, the night he tried to mask his treacherous poison behind a salesman's grin. I pulled the cork. The rich aroma of dark berries and aged oak filled the cool air. I poured a generous measure into a heavy crystal glass, watching the deep crimson liquid swirl and catch the low light of the room. I carried the glass into my private study, sinking deeply into my favorite leather wingback chair near the unlit stone fireplace. I took a slow, deliberate sip. It tasted entirely different tonight. At their dinner table, surrounded by lies and hidden legal traps, the wine had tasted like ash and betrayal. Tonight, sitting alone in the impenetrable fortress I had successfully defended, it tasted like absolute victory. I let my head rest against the soft leather back of the chair, closing my eyes and breathing in the profound peace. I had fought a brutal war on multiple fronts against my own flesh and blood, a violent shadow syndicate, and the ticking clock of a manipulated legal system. I had navigated the darkness, outsmarted the predators at every single turn, and emerged completely unscathed. As I sat there, the warmth of the expensive wine settling deep in my chest, a profound and necessary realization washed over me. For 40 years, I had operated under a highly dangerous illusion. I spent my youth breaking my back on the freezing loading docks, pulling brutal double shifts, missing holidays, and grinding my bones to dust to build a multi-million-dollar shipping empire. I told myself I was building an untouchable dynasty. I believed that passing down a massive generational fortune to my daughter was the ultimate, unquestionable measure of my success as a father. But I had been completely blind to the monster I was continuously feeding. Kendra never respected the empire because she never had to carry a single heavy brick to build it. She looked at me and never saw a father who loved her or a man who sacrificed for her. She only saw an automated teller machine with a pulse. She saw a frustrating obstacle standing between her and a massive inheritance. My wealth had become a toxic curse, attracting spineless parasites like Logan and poisoning the only family I thought I had left. But wealth is only truly toxic if you leave it in the wrong hands. I thought about my late wife, Naomi. She was there when we had absolutely nothing but a rusted delivery truck and a kitchen table covered in unpaid bills. She had a heart of pure gold, always quietly slipping folded cash to the neighborhood kids who needed winter coats or school supplies. I knew exactly what she would have wanted me to do with the massive empire we built together. The very next morning, I called Ethan Hayes back into my office. I instructed him to draw up the permanent charter for the Naomi Wesley Memorial Foundation. I took a massive portion of the liquid assets I had repatriated from the offshore trust and permanently endowed a comprehensive scholarship program. It was designed specifically for underprivileged, fiercely driven youth in the inner city. Young men and women who were currently sweeping warehouse floors on the night shift, just like I had done, who possessed the burning hunger to succeed but lacked the financial capital. Months later, I sat across a boardroom table from the first cohort of scholarship recipients. I looked into their eyes and saw the raw, unstoppable determination that Kendra never possessed. I saw genuine, tearful gratitude. In that moment, handing over fully funded tuition checks to strangers who had fought tooth and nail for a chance at a better life, the last lingering sting of my daughter's betrayal completely vanished. I had spent my life building a financial empire for a daughter who despised me, but I had finally found my true, lasting legacy. Society heavily conditions us to believe that family is an unbreakable, sacred bond forged strictly by blood. We are constantly told to forgive the absolute unforgivable simply because we share the same genetic code. But that is a dangerous lie designed to keep victims permanently chained to their abusers. Family is not defined by blood. Family is defined by mutual respect. It is unquestionable loyalty when it is highly inconvenient. It is protecting each other when the wolves are scratching at the door, not being the treacherous one who unlocks the deadbolt to let the wolves inside. People who hear the quiet whispers of my story within the city's financial circles sometimes assume I am a cold, ruthless man who actively destroyed his own daughter out of sheer spite. But they are entirely wrong. I did not destroy Kendra. I simply stopped being her human shield. I stopped paying for her reckless mistakes. I stepped completely out of her way, and she used her own arrogance, bottomless greed, and blinding entitlement to obliterate herself. The financial and legal trap she fell into was the exact trap she meticulously built for me. The silent adjustment is officially complete. The chessboard has been cleared. The toxic elements have been permanently excised from my ecosystem. I am 69 years old, and for the first time in my entire adult life, I am completely unburdened by the crushing weight of ungrateful expectations. Most men my age are quietly fading into the background, retreating into retirement, and watching the clock tick down. Not me. I have a massive shipping empire to run, a charitable foundation to grow, and a vibrant world of new possibilities stretching out in front of me. I am completely free, and my life has just truly begun. As I sat in the quiet solitude of my mahogany study, the warmth of the expensive red wine settling deeply into my chest, I realized that the profound events of the past few weeks had unearthed another fundamental truth. It was a lesson far more complex than simply recognizing that family is defined by respect rather than blood. The ultimate lesson I extracted from the ashes of my daughter's betrayal was about the incredibly corrosive nature of unearned privilege and the absolute terrifying supremacy of calculated patience. For decades, I had operated under the fundamental delusion that providing a completely frictionless existence for my child was the ultimate expression of parental love. I had looked at the brutal, freezing loading docks where I broke my back in my 20s, the endless night shifts and the terrifying financial uncertainties of building a shipping empire from scratch, and I swore that Kendra would never have to experience a single second of that agony. I deliberately built a massive, impenetrable fortress of wealth around her, shielding her from every consequence, every failure, and every minor discomfort the world had to offer. But sitting here now, victorious yet deeply reflective, I finally understood the catastrophic error in my methodology. By removing all the heavy stones from her path, I had completely robbed her of the opportunity to build any emotional or moral muscle. Struggle is not merely an unfortunate byproduct of life. It is the essential furnace where human character is forged. When you hand a person a massive multi-million-dollar empire on a silver platter without demanding that they bleed sweat and sacrifice for it, they do not view that empire with gratitude. They view it with blinding, arrogant entitlement. Kendra did not see the decades of sleepless nights, the ruthless boardroom negotiations, or the physical toll my business took on my aging body. She simply saw a magical fountain of infinite resources that she fundamentally believed belonged to her by divine right. Because she never had to earn a single dollar, she completely lacked the capacity to respect the absolute value of one. That profound absence of respect mutated into a toxic, festering greed. It made her dangerously susceptible to a polished, hollow predator like Logan, who whispered sweet, venomous promises of absolute control into her ear. Together they convinced themselves that because I was old, I was obsolete. They believed that the wealth I had generated was merely waiting to be properly utilized by a younger, more deserving generation. They mistook my quiet, loving generosity for fundamental weakness. That leads me to the second half of this profound lesson, the weaponization of absolute, unbroken silence. In our modern, hyper-connected society, people are conditioned to react instantly to every perceived slight. When someone attacks you, the immediate instinctual response is to scream, to defend yourself, to lash out loudly, and to prove your absolute dominance. Logan and Kendra fully expected me to explode the moment they initiated their treacherous plan. When Kendra slid that heavily doctored medical waiver across the elegant dining table, she anticipated a furious, screaming reaction. She wanted me to flip the table, to curse her name, to throw a massive tantrum. Why? Because a loud emotional reaction is entirely predictable. It is easily categorized, easily recorded, and easily weaponized in a court of law to prove that an elderly man has completely lost his rational faculties. Anger is the absolute clearest indicator of a loss of control. But I chose the exact opposite path. I chose the terrifying, impenetrable armor of calculated silence. When you refuse to react, you completely strip your enemy of their tactical roadmap. Silence is a psychological void, and human beings are naturally terrified of the unknown. By smiling, apologizing for spilling my wine, and quietly walking out the front door, I denied them the dramatic confrontation they desperately needed to validate their narrative. I forced them to operate entirely in the dark. In the brutal world of international commercial shipping, the most dangerous competitor is never the one who loudly threatens you in the boardroom. It is the one who smiles, warmly shakes your hand, and quietly buys the massive bank that holds the mortgage on your entire corporate fleet. My silence allowed Kendra and Logan to become completely intoxicated by their own perceived brilliance. Because I did not openly fight them, they automatically assumed they had already won. That staggering arrogance blinded them to the meticulous, lethal traps I was quietly laying beneath their feet. When the unlicensed thugs dragged me out of my own home and locked me in that sterile psychiatric cell, I did not waste my energy screaming at the reinforced steel door. I did not beg the cold, unsympathetic nurses for mercy. I conserved every ounce of my mental energy carefully analyzing my environment until I spotted the weak link in their operation, the desperate, financially ruined orderly. I used my silence to observe, to plan, and to execute a flawless counteroffensive. When Kendra proudly marched into my cell with the transfer deed to the commercial docklands, My quiet, trembling submission was the ultimate sleight of hand. She was so completely focused on her imminent victory that she failed to notice the deliberate fatal flaw I embedded directly into my signature. This is the absolute core of the lesson. True power does not need to announce itself. True power sits quietly in the back row of the courtroom watching the enemy hang themselves with the very rope they stole from your garage. By the time Ethan Hayes stood up before the judge and triggered the poison pill protocol, it was already far too late for Logan and Kendra to realize they had been completely outmaneuvered. The trap had not just closed, it had been welded shut by their own impatient greed. They had marched into a federal building and voluntarily assumed a $7 million environmental liability because they were too arrogant to believe an old man could outsmart them. I did not have to raise my voice once to completely dismantle their entire existence. I simply stepped out of the way and allowed the overwhelming weight of their own monumental hubris to crush them into dust. Reflecting on this, I realize how this philosophy extends far beyond the boundaries of my personal family tragedy. It is a universal truth applicable to business, to relationships, and to the fundamental navigation of life. The world is heavily populated by loud, frantic individuals who constantly demand things they have absolutely never earned. They believe that their mere existence entitles them to the rewards of someone else's lifelong labor. They will smile to your face, drink your expensive wine, and quietly conspire to strip you of everything you hold dear. You cannot reason with this specific brand of entitlement. You cannot negotiate with a parasite. The only effective strategy is absolute, ruthless detachment. You must possess the emotional fortitude to look at someone you once loved, recognize that they have become a lethal threat to your peace, and sever the connection without a single drop of hesitation. The peace I feel now is not derived from the destruction of my daughter. It is derived from the profound liberation of finally shedding a toxic burden I carried for decades. I no longer have to constantly monitor my bank accounts to see how much Logan has siphoned away for another failed tech venture. I no longer have to endure Kendra's thinly veiled insults or her constant exhausting demands for more luxury. My massive estate is no longer a holding pen for ungrateful heirs. It is a powerful engine for genuine transformational good. The Naomi Wesley Memorial Foundation is currently funding the complete university education of 50 brilliant underprivileged students. These are young adults who understand the absolute value of a dollar because they have had to bleed for every single one they have ever earned. When I read their gratitude letters, I do not see the manufactured manipulative affection my daughter used to give me. I see raw, unfiltered hope. I see the incredible future of my actual legacy. This transition from being a blindly devoted father to a fiercely independent, purposeful philanthropist has completely redefined my entire existence. At 69 years old, society expects a man to quietly fade into the background to accept the indignities of aging and to surrender control to the younger generation. But I refuse to adhere to that pathetic script. I have completely reclaimed my absolute autonomy. I wake up every morning with a crystal clear mind and a deeply energized spirit. I manage my shipping empire with the exact same ruthless precision I employed in my 30s. I travel the world not as a tired tourist, but as a man completely unburdened by the heavy chains of familial obligation. I am living proof that an ending, no matter how incredibly painful or traumatic it may initially seem, is very often the exact necessary catalyst for a magnificent new beginning. The story of my silent adjustment is a testament to the fact that you are never entirely trapped. No matter how deeply the betrayal cuts, no matter how closely the enemy is related to you by blood, and no matter how heavily the odds seem stacked against you, you always possess the ultimate power to rewrite the narrative. You just have to be willing to endure the temporary heartbreak required to execute the permanent solution. You must learn to value your own peace and dignity far above the toxic comfort of maintaining a broken family illusion. You must learn to weaponize your silence to let your actions speak with absolute, undeniable finality, and to absolutely never apologize for protecting the empire you sacrificed your entire life to build. If you are listening to my story today and you recognize these toxic patterns in your own life, I want you to pay very close attention to what I am about to say. Do not wait for the predator at your dinner table to strike first. Do not allow guilt, societal expectations, or the heavy manipulation of toxic family members to convince you that you must continually sacrifice your own mental health and financial security for their endless, unearned comfort. Recognize the absolute value of your own hard work. Protect your peace with the same fierce, uncompromising intensity that you would use to protect your own life, because ultimately, your peace is your life. The moment you realize that you do not owe anyone a single piece of your soul simply because you share a genetic lineage, you will unlock a level of personal freedom that is absolutely intoxicating. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my journey. The silent adjustment was the hardest, most brutal chapter of my entire life, but it was also the absolute most necessary. It completely stripped away the comfortable lies I had been living and forced me to confront the harsh, undeniable reality of who my daughter truly was. But out of that profound darkness, I found a brilliant, purposeful new light. I found my true family in the ambitious, grateful students my foundation supports, and I found an unshakable, permanent peace within my own heart. If my story resonated with you, if you have ever had to make the incredibly difficult decision to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your own sanity, or if you simply believe in the absolute power of standing up for your own dignity, please let me know in the comments below. I read every single one, and I deeply appreciate the community we are building together here. Share your own stories of silent adjustments. Let us remind each other that we are absolutely never alone in these battles. Please hit that like button to help this story reach others who might desperately need to hear this exact message today. Share this video with anyone who is currently struggling with ungrateful, manipulative relatives. And if you have not already, please hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another powerful life story. Your support allows me to continue sharing these vital, deeply personal experiences. Remember, your life is your own absolute masterpiece. Do not ever let anyone else hold the pen. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and never be afraid to embrace the absolute power of your own silence. I will see you all in the very next story.